Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the velvet-draped candlelit corners of royal palaces. Not the official tours, not the portraits or coronation gowns, but the whispered truths that history textbooks politely left out. This isn't your average lesson in monarchy. We're talking about what really happened behind those ornately carved doors, where silk sheets hid secrets, and every creak of the floorboards might have meant a new scandal. And trust me, you probably won't survive this if you think history is all about powdered wigs and chivalrous kings. Nah, the truth is messier, weirder, and so much steamier than you were ever told. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not going to beg. Just know, if you're into raw, myth-busting journeys through time with a hint of irreverence, you're in the right bedchamber. Quick question before we dim the lights. Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? I'm always curious if you're listening from a midnight hideout in Madrid or an early morning commute in Ohio. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Yeah, the literal shimmering hallway that Instagram can't get enough of. But as you're standing there, soaking in the 17th century opulence, you get the distinct feeling that this place wasn't just built for show. Sure, it's all chandeliers and gold leaf and political swagger, but beneath it all, this was a place wired for watching, scheming, and yes, seducing. Here's the part that history smoothed over. Royal palaces were designed as stages for performance, power performance, fertility performance, loyalty performance, and very much sex performance. The palace wasn't just a home, it was a machine. Every corridor and curtain had a purpose, and a lot of that purpose centred around making, controlling, or weaponising intimacy. Take Louis XIV. He didn't just build Versailles as a symbol of his divine rule, he literally designed it to keep his nobles close and distracted. Think about that. You, a young courtier, might dream of rising through the ranks, but to do that, you'd have to play the palace's games. You had to be visible, charming, available, and sometimes sexually useful. Not just to the king, but to whoever held sway at the moment. Gossip could promote you, rumour could destroy you, and one misstep could mean exile. All for who you kissed, or didn't. Now here's a historical gem. Louis XIV's daily routine was so ritualised that courtiers fought over who got to hand him his slippers. But the real social warfare happened after dark, when alliances weren't forged through treaties, but through trysts. Behind every noble marriage was often a hidden string of affairs, some strategic, others scandalous, and everyone knew it. The bedroom wasn't private, it was political real estate. And speaking of the royal bedroom, let's just clear something up. The king's bed was not his sanctuary. It was a freaking public stage. Literally. Every morning, Louis XIV held a ceremony called the lever, or rising, where select nobles were allowed to watch him wake up and get dressed. Like front row seats to a very boring, very powerful show. Why? Because proximity meant influence. But there was more. The Queen's bed, too, became a stage for reproduction. If a royal heir was conceived, that act was a state affair. No candles and slow jams here. Sometimes there were people literally standing outside the door waiting for confirmation. The idea of privacy just didn't exist the way we think of it. In fact, one quirky fringe fact. At Versailles, the palace had no toilets, just commodes and chamber pots behind screens or curtains, which meant, yeah, smells mixed with seduction in real time. You can imagine what that does to the mood. So while paintings might show elegance and powdered elegance, the lived experience was a whole different vibe. A blend of perfume, sweat, ambition, and sometimes desperation. Now let's talk about something historians still squabble over. There's this ongoing debate about whether these sexual arrangements, mistresses, affairs, open secrets, were liberating or exploitative. Some argue that royal mistresses like Madame de Pompadour wielded real influence and carved out power that wives often didn't have. Others argue they were trapped, groomed, and ultimately disposable once their appeal faded. Were they agents of their own fate or pawns in the king's endless appetite? Scholars are still arguing. You, on the other hand, are just trying to imagine how any of this worked with all those corsets and wigs. Still, behind the lace and layers, there's a darker undercurrent. Control. Sexuality was managed like land, taxed like wine, and observed like state secrets. The king's fertility was national business. The queen's virtue was foreign policy. And you, if you were lucky enough to be in this world, your body could be your greatest weapon. Or your downfall. There was no just say no in royal court. You navigated desire like you navigated war, strategically, carefully, and always at risk. The palace walls might have echoed with laughter and music, but they also heard whispers of jealousy, blackmail, secret pregnancies, and forbidden love. And at the centre of it all was this. Sex wasn't personal. It was power, dressed in silk. By now you're seeing it. The polished fantasy of royal romance is just that. A fantasy. Underneath the crown jewels and ceremonial beds, you're standing in a pressure cooker of expectations, betrayals, and political heat, and it's only going to get more complicated from here. You take one last glance around the hall of mirrors, not to admire the glitter, but to imagine what those mirrors have seen. The silent agreements, the quiet heartbreaks, the moments where pleasure met politics, and nobody left unscathed. You're walking deeper into the palace now, past the mirror-lined hall and into the heart of royal life, the bedchamber. But let's be real, calling it a bedroom is misleading. This space wasn't for sleeping, at least not in the way you're thinking. It was a stage, and like any good stage, it had an audience. Royal sex wasn't just intimate, it was ceremonial, theatrical, and disturbingly public. Let's pause here for a minute and soak that in. You're lying in a massive canopied bed, maybe under some French brocade worth more than your entire village, and you're not alone. Sure, your new spouse is there, but so are priests, advisors, and sometimes even your mother-in-law. Because consummation, that's not just a personal moment, it's a political checkpoint. No pressure, right? It's the 16th century and you're a young princess just married off to a nobleman whose breath smells like roasted boar and disappointment. You've known him for about 20 minutes. Now you're being walked to your marriage bed while an entire crowd watches you lie down. Sometimes they even tuck you in. Yeah. Imagine your in-laws helping with that part. The goal? Make sure there's no funny business, like faking the marriage or skipping the important part. Because until the marriage is consummated, it isn't real. And if the bed doesn't get busy, the political alliance doesn't count. In some courts, especially Tudor England, this process was official enough to come with witnesses. Not of the act itself, but of the setup, the nudity, and the shared bed. The logic was twisted. If a marriage falls apart later, you've got legal backup. See? They definitely got naked together. It's on record. Romantic, right? One historical case that's still whispered about? The marriage of Mary Tudor to Philip II of Spain in 1554. People literally stood outside the royal bedchamber door waiting to hear noises, or signs of movement, or maybe just a cough. The goal was confirmation, proof that the two had, in fact, gotten down to the business of monarchy making. And yes, it was business. The act wasn't about pleasure, it was about lineage, succession, and frankly, fertility rates. Now here's where things get weird, like fringe fact weird. In some medieval courts, there were official inspectors of virginity. These were usually older women, midwives mostly, tasked with confirming whether a royal bride was intact before her wedding night. And afterward, they'd sometimes inspect the bedsheets. The absence or presence of blood could make or break a queen's reputation. Forget how humiliating that sounds. Think of the sheer biological inaccuracy. There's no universal proof of virginity, and yet it was treated like a signed contract. A contract you couldn't contest, even if you bled because of nerves or didn't bleed at all because, well, biology isn't polite. So, here you are, lying in a giant bed stripped of autonomy, while your body becomes a battleground for politics and perception. And guess what? The king doesn't always want to be there either. Royal marriages weren't usually love matches. They were power plays. Heirs had to be produced, alliances sealed. Whether either party enjoyed the night was not part of the equation. And for some monarchs, that pressure caused very real, very well documented anxiety. Historians still debate whether these royal rituals were purely symbolic, or if they had a deeper psychological impact. Did the public nature of consummation ceremonies affect royal couples' ability to connect? Were some of these early failures in marriage less about incompatibility and more about trauma? The record isn't clear. But one thing's for sure, sex in the palace was never just about two people. It was about everyone else who needed that union to work. And it wasn't just the wedding night. Even after marriage, royal couples were often expected to keep producing heirs, again, with a curious amount of public interest. In some cases, courtiers or staff would observe how often the couple retired to their chamber together. Diaries were kept, notes were taken, and if there weren't enough conjugal visits, people noticed. Rumours flew. Political enemies stirred the pot. After all, a childless marriage meant instability, and instability meant open season for your rivals. Take the example of King Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves. Their marriage was never consummated, and Henry had it annulled on those grounds. He claimed she repulsed him, despite having approved her portrait beforehand. Historians still argue whether his claims were legit or a convenient excuse to escape a dull match. Regardless, it highlights how easily the sexual narrative could be weaponized. One man's disappointment became a national scandal, and Anne? She was lucky. Henry didn't behead her, just tossed her aside with a nice castle and a pension. Sometimes kings refused to perform. Other times, queens weren't keen, and occasionally both parties had lovers elsewhere and just went through the motions, or didn't. And this gets swept under the rug when we talk about these royal unions like they were perfect or virtuous or steeped in love. They weren't. They were performances. Sometimes awkward, sometimes painful, occasionally tender, but always political. You're getting the sense now, right? That the palaces we associate with glamour were also pressure cookers of expectation. Sex wasn't just about pleasure. It was about politics. It was evidence. It was currency. And for royals, it was never entirely theirs. The more you walk these halls, the clearer it becomes. The royal bedchamber wasn't a retreat. It was a chessboard, and everyone, from bishops to distant cousins, was watching your next move. You're still in the palace, but now you've slipped past the official wings and into quieter, more decadent quarters. The kind of place history books barely mention, but gossip never forgets. The king's private apartments. And here the rules are different. The politics don't vanish, but they take on a silkier texture. This is where mistresses lived. Not hidden away in shame, but proudly, even officially. These weren't side affairs. These were full-time positions with titles, income, influence, and, let's be honest, lavish perks. If you were the mistress of Louis XV, for example, you didn't sneak through a back door. You had your own suite in the palace, often right above or beside the king's. You had servants, a wardrobe allowance, and access to the kind of power that could make or break court careers. They called it maîtresse en titre, official mistress, and once you had that title, you were practically untouchable, as long as the king liked you. Right now, you're imagining the infamous Parc aux Cerfs, which sounds like a lovely place to picnic until you realise it was essentially a secret harem tucked within the palace grounds. Louis XV kept young women there, many of them extremely young, visited discreetly and supported lavishly. Some stayed for days, others months. Occasionally they got pregnant. If they were lucky, they were given dowries and married off. If not, they just disappeared from the records. It's the kind of story that makes people uncomfortable, especially when it involves monarchs still painted in romantic tones. Louis XV wasn't some isolated creep. He was part of a long line of kings for whom multiple lovers weren't just expected. They were practically part of the job description. And mistresses weren't necessarily victims either. Many knew exactly what they were doing, using their position to elevate their families, push political agendas, or carve out rare spaces of female agency in a world that offered very few. Take Madame de Pompadour, easily one of the most powerful royal mistresses in history. She wasn't just a pretty face. She helped shape French foreign policy, supported Enlightenment philosophers, and commissioned some of the era's greatest art. And yet, even she knew her shelf life had limits. When she and Louis XV stopped being lovers, she remained his close confidant, still pulling strings, but from a different side of the bed. The whole arrangement is one big contradiction. On the surface, royal courts were built on piety and propriety. The church was often in bed, metaphorically, with the crown. But under that gilded veneer, there was a web of affairs that everyone knew about and nobody officially acknowledged. It's the political equivalent of don't ask, don't tell, except with more wigs and fewer boundaries. Here's your fringe fact. At one point in Versailles, courtiers could buy tickets to see the king's mistress ride through the palace gardens. Imagine that. Not just tolerating the king's affair, but turning it into public entertainment. It's hard to wrap your head around unless you accept that sex and spectacle went hand in hand in these circles. Of course, not all mistresses had it good. Some were tossed aside the moment their favour faded. Some were used and silenced. Others died mysteriously. Poisonings weren't exactly common, but they weren't unheard of either. The deeper you dig into palace life, the more it starts to resemble a very dangerous game of favourites. If you were beautiful, charming and clever, you might get everything you ever wanted. If you slipped, you vanished. No second chances, no gentle exits. The same system that lifted you could break you just as quickly. One of the stranger debates among scholars now is whether mistresses should be seen as empowered women or manipulated girls. Was Madame du Barry, Louis XV's last mistress, a calculating social climber or a teenage girl sold into the role by a greedy family? The records show both versions, and that ambiguity is everywhere. These were real women, with real desires and fears, living in a system that both exalted and devoured them. It's not a fairy tale, it's a pressure chamber with velvet curtains. Meanwhile, queens, actual wives, often had far less influence. They were figureheads, bearers of airs, keepers of appearances. The king could ignore them completely, and often did. As long as she kept quiet and produced children, the queen's job was considered done. But the mistress, she was conversation, she was policy, she was fashion. Entire court factions aligned behind or against her. Her bedroom was a war room with perfume bottles and a hidden dagger or two. You're beginning to see the full picture now. In royal palaces, sex wasn't just about biology. It was status, leverage, power. Being chosen wasn't just romantic, it was transformational. And being cast aside, that was social death. So you walk through these plush rooms and wonder what it must have felt like to live under that kind of scrutiny. Every glance from the king could make or break you. Every other woman was competition. And love? That was a luxury few could afford. Most relationships here were contracts in disguise. Yet for all that, some mistresses did love their kings. Let us survive. Passionate, personal, surprisingly tender. And maybe that's the strangest part. That within this cold machine of monarchy, real emotion could still bloom, even if it wasn't allowed to last. You pass a mirror, cracked slightly at the edge. Maybe it's just old. Maybe it once reflected someone waiting for the king to return. Maybe it still remembers. The door you push open now is heavier, older, and carved with symbols you don't quite recognise. It groans like it remembers things it would rather forget. You're stepping into Tudor England, and the temperature drops, not just physically, but in tone. This isn't Versailles, where sex was glittered up and turned into a glamorous side hustle. This is England in the 1500s, where everything about your body is everyone else's business, and your wedding night could become a national ceremony, or a legal trial. Welcome to the age of virginity tests, public bedding rituals, and some truly disturbing traditions. You're in a cold stone chamber, probably in a castle like Hampton Court. The tapestries don't do much to muffle the chill, and you can hear footsteps echoing down the hall. Servants, maybe nobles, all waiting outside for, well, it. You're the newly married couple, barely done with the feast, and now everyone expects you to produce an heir, or at least show convincing signs that one might be on the way eventually. No pressure, though. Tonight is the bedding ceremony, and if you think that sounds like a private affair, think again. This ritual involved guiding the bride and groom to bed in front of witnesses. The crowd, family, clergy, courtiers, would watch as the couple was led into the chamber, sometimes undressed down to their shifts or even naked depending on the custom. If you were lucky, they'd leave before things got too personal. If you weren't, they'd hang around, waiting for evidence the next morning. That might mean a bloodied bedsheet, a satisfied groom, or just a lot of assumptions and some awkward eye contact. This wasn't just voyeurism for sport. It was legal. If the marriage fell apart later, people would be called on to testify whether it had been consummated. These weren't pervy neighbours. They were potential expert witnesses in royal court. For Henry VIII, especially, consummation wasn't just bedroom business. It was a legal weapon. The marriage to Anne of Cleves, for example, was annulled because Henry claimed he couldn't perform. Historians still debate whether he was just not attracted to her, physically unable, or trying to get out of an alliance he never wanted in the first place. Here's a quirky but very real fringe fact. In some noble households, if a marriage was struggling to be consummated, elders would step in, sometimes literally. There are recorded cases where mothers or aunts stood nearby giving advice, or where servants were ordered to stay in the room just in case. In other words, your first sexual experience could come with coaching, from your family. That's the stuff of therapy sessions centuries later, and of course, for women the stakes were even higher. A bride's virginity was like a security deposit. Everyone involved in the marriage, especially if it was political, wanted proof that she hadn't been touched. In some cases, the bride was examined by midwives or noblewomen to confirm she was intact. This was treated like science. Spoiler, it wasn't. The hymen myth has done a lot of damage, and back then it was taken as gospel truth. But a missing hymen didn't necessarily mean anything had happened. It could tear from riding a horse or climbing stairs. Still, a bride who didn't bleed was instantly suspect. Which brings us to Catherine of Aragon. Her first marriage to Arthur, Prince of Wales, Henry VIII's older brother, was a disaster wrapped in a mystery. Arthur died young, and the big question afterward was whether the marriage had been consummated. Catherine insisted it hadn't. Henry, years later, claimed it had. This little detail? It spiralled into an international crisis, because if she had slept with Arthur, then technically marrying Henry, his brother, might be incestuous, at least by the rules of the time. The Pope gave a dispensation, but when Henry wanted out of the marriage, he dragged that bedroom back into court like it was Exhibit A. This wasn't just personal drama, it was geopolitics, and the reason it worked as legal ammunition was because of the absurd weight placed on bedroom details. Entire nations shifted alliances based on who did or didn't sleep with whom. So, yeah, that stained sheet on your wedding night, it could decide the fate of your country, no big deal. Some historians now debate how accurate these rituals really were. Did every noble marriage involve a public bedding? Were all brides subjected to examination? It's hard to say. The written accounts may exaggerate or blur the lines between common practice and extreme examples. But what's clear is that the fear of scandal, of illegitimacy, of losing honour over rumours of premarital sex, was real enough to create these performative rituals, and they weren't just symbolic, they had teeth. You glance around this cold room and imagine the weight of expectation. The scratchy linen sheets, the fire that never quite warms the stone walls. Your husband, basically a stranger, lying next to you, smelling like mead and nerves. Outside, nobles are whispering, wondering if the alliance will hold, wondering if you'll do your duty. You're not even thinking about pleasure, you're thinking about pressure, about legacy, about survival. Now, here's where things take a weird turn. The church often got involved not just in weddings, but in consummations. Priests gave advice. Confessors heard details. Sometimes they were sent to investigate if things weren't going well. One royal physician even recommended an aphrodisiac made from powdered deer penis. So, yeah, science was evolving. You leave the room and the bedding ceremony fades into history, but it leaves a residue. You realise something unsettling. In the royal world, sex wasn't just watched, it was legislated. Your body wasn't yours, it belonged to the dynasty, and what happened in your bedroom was never going to stay there. It's a strange blend of the sacred and the absurd. Intimacy, reduced to performance. Passion, measured in stains and witnesses. And you. You're starting to see that the royal fairy tale had a lot more strings than sparkles. Now you find yourself standing in a narrow hallway, lit by flickering candle sconces, deep in the older part of a sprawling palace. The walls are close, the air stale, and it feels like the building itself is holding its breath. You've stepped into the quieter corridors of royal history, the ones where names were whispered, not engraved. This is where the truth about heirs, affairs, and royal bastards hides, packed tight between legacy and denial. Because if you think royal bloodlines were neat little family trees, you're about to get slapped with an entire forest of secret branches. Let's be blunt. The idea of pure royal lineage is mostly a myth. On paper, the story is simple. King marries queen, queen births heir, history moves on. But in real life, that straight line wobbles fast. Behind every legitimate child, there were often multiple illegitimate ones, tucked into side estates, quietly married off, or conveniently ignored. And in many cases, those so-called royal bastards were better connected, better educated, and more respected than anyone wanted to admit. Take Charles II of England. No legitimate children, none. Yet he fathered at least 12 illegitimate ones, all while married to Catherine of Braganza. She remained childless, which wasn't exactly great for dynastic stability, But Charles didn't seem too concerned. His mistresses bore him children regularly, and he gave many of those offspring titles, land and positions at court. One of his sons, the Duke of Monmouth, even tried to claim the throne. He failed, but the attempt nearly split the country in two. That's how messy the game got when illegitimacy rubbed elbows with ambition. Here's where things get juicy. Sometimes royal bastards weren't just tolerated, they were cherished. Take Henry Fitzroy, the illegitimate son of Henry VIII. Henry gave him a dukedom, a mansion, and treated him as a potential heir when his legitimate line looked shaky. There was even talk, brief but very real, of changing the law to let Fitzroy inherit the throne. That's how desperate Henry was for a male successor, and yes, it caused outrage. Because if the king could just pick and choose which sons counted, then what even was legitimacy? It gets even more complicated when you factor in affairs that weren't acknowledged. The number of maybe royal children, those born to ladies-in-waiting, courtiers, even servants, is impossible to know. But the rumours? Oh, they never stopped. Some queens were suspected of having lovers. Some kings had trysts with the help. Occasionally a child would appear who looked just a little too much like a monarch. A high forehead, the wrong eye colour, an oddly familiar jawline. But unless the king claimed them, they stayed ghosts in the system. And this is where one of the biggest scholarly debates still simmers. How many heirs were actually not the product of their presumed parents? Back then, DNA testing didn't exist, so people went off timing, appearance, and court gossip. If a queen gave birth after her husband had been off at war for 9 months, well, questions got asked, but nobody wanted to push too hard, because acknowledging the wrong parent could topple entire dynasties. Which brings us to a fringe fact that sounds like pure fiction. In France during the 17th century, there was a persistent rumour that Louis XIV's real father wasn't Louis XIII, but Cardinal Mazarin, his mother's advisor and alleged lover. No one could prove it, and the claim was officially denied, but the gossip lingered. It still does, and whether or not it's true, it highlights how fragile the whole royal system was. One whispered doubt, one private mistake, and suddenly the entire concept of divine rule looked like a very human mess. And don't even get started on paternity cover-ups. In many courts, if a noblewoman became pregnant in a way that wasn't politically convenient, the child could be passed off as someone else's. Sometimes a servant would take the blame. Other times the baby would be quietly relocated and raised by loyal allies. There are whole threads in historical documents where children appear suddenly in one household, with no real record of where they came from, like plot twists in a soap opera, but with castles and real consequences. You're starting to understand now that royal reproduction wasn't just biology, it was narrative control. Who got counted, who got erased, who got promoted from bastard to beloved. That all depended on who held the power, and when the power shifted, so did the story. Illegitimate sons could become dukes, legitimate ones could be disinherited, daughters could be married off to silence, or used to sew up alliances no one wanted to talk about. There's also the question of why kings were so prolific with mistresses, while queens were kept under lock and key. The double standard wasn't just cultural, it was strategic. A king's illegitimate children, while problematic, didn't usually threaten succession unless acknowledged. But a queen's illegitimate child? That could create a full-blown crisis, because if she had a child by someone else, that baby might be mistaken for the rightful heir, and then the crown itself could fall into the wrong hands. So queens were guarded, watched and judged harshly, while kings got away with half a village full of secret children. That imbalance wasn't just sexist, it was calculated. A queen's womb was national territory. A king's... well, his was considered a gift to the world. You walk past an old painting in one of the side corridors. It's cracked with age, the colours faded. The subject is a noble boy, maybe 7 or 8, dressed in velvet and lace, standing proudly in a garden. No nameplate, no royal crest. But something about his face, his jawline, his eyes, looks familiar. Too familiar. He's the son of someone important, no doubt. Just not officially. This is the legacy no one talks about. The sons and daughters of shadowed liaisons. The heirs who weren't allowed to inherit. The children who were loved in secret and denied in public. They may not have worn crowns, but they walked the halls, and they carried stories that history still hasn't figured out how to tell. Now you're climbing a set of winding stairs tucked behind a heavy curtain. One of those secret winding passages meant only for the most trusted inner circle. The kind of place where whispers thrive and eyes watch even when no one's around. Up here, the air is thicker somehow, like incense and sweat mixed with old secrets. You're walking into the heart of royal contradiction. A place where religion meets indulgence, where kings claim divine right while indulging in anything but divine behaviour. This is where God's chosen ruler somehow justified a rotating cast of lovers, and sex wasn't just accepted, it was rationalised as holy duty. You reach the top of the stairs and enter what looks like a private chapel, but the stained glass glows a little too theatrically, and the pews seem far too pristine. This isn't for the masses. This is for the monarch's curated image. Divine right of kings, they called it. The idea that the king was chosen by God himself. Which, if you think about it, is an incredible gig. Not only do you get to wear the crown, but you can basically do whatever you want and still claim moral superiority, including your late-night visits to the bedchambers of women who are definitely not your wife. Royal sex, in many cases, was seen as an extension of royal power. The king's body wasn't just his own, it was a symbol of national vitality. If he was virile, the kingdom was strong. If he was impotent or sterile, the court whispered about curses and bad omens. So of course, bedding women, sometimes many women, wasn't a character flaw. It was branding, a way to prove, over and over, that the divine right extended all the way under the sheets. Let's be clear, this wasn't just egotism. There were actual sermons, theological tracts, and advisors who bent scripture into pretzels to justify this behaviour. If the king was God's anointed, then his pleasure was practically sacred. His sins, those were between him and heaven. Everyone else, definitely judged. But the king, he was expected to produce heirs, and if the queen couldn't do it, well, he had to fulfill his divine responsibility somehow, preferably with a discreet mistress. Or 3. Take Philip IV of Spain, on the surface deeply religious, daily mass, public piety. But behind palace doors, an almost ridiculous number of affairs. Historians now believe he fathered more than 30 illegitimate children, and while many were hushed up, a few were given enough attention to make the Queen, already under massive pressure, look like a mere footnote. But here's the kicker. His advisors never pushed back. In fact, some encouraged him, because to them, a king who wasn't sexually active seemed weak, almost unnatural. And here's a quirky side fact that feels too ironic to be real. Some kings reportedly had confessor schedules. That's right. After a night with their mistress, they'd visit their private priest in the morning, confess, receive absolution, and get right back to business. It was practically a ritual. Sin, confess, repeat. The cycle made their indulgence feel tidy, even justified. After all, they were humble enough to admit their flaws, and God? He had already forgiven them. Probably. But not everyone bought it. There were always people at court who resented the double standard. Queens, of course, suffered the most. If a king strayed, it was divine expression. If a queen even looked too friendly with another man, she was branded a harlot. Take Queen Caroline of Brunswick, wife of George IV of England. Their marriage was miserable, and George openly paraded mistresses. Caroline, accused, without real evidence, of infidelity, was publicly humiliated, put on trial, and nearly denied entry to her own coronation. George, meanwhile, continued to hold public ceremonies like a man untouched by scandal. The hypocrisy practically glowed. It brings us to one of the most debated questions among historians. Did divine right excuse immoral behaviour, or did it simply mask it? Some scholars argue that kings genuinely believed they were above human judgment, that they weren't hypocrites, just deluded. Others believe they knew exactly what they were doing, using religion as a kind of PR strategy to silence critics and maintain control. And you're left wondering, if everyone knew the king was sleeping around and no one could call him out without risking exile, or worse, what kind of twisted morality did the court live by? Probably the kind where appearances mattered more than truth, where piety was about optics, not action, where confession replaced accountability. And the people who suffered, servants, mistresses, even the queen, were collateral in a divine drama that had nothing to do with actual faith. Still, despite all the contradictions, this twisted theology worked for centuries. It gave kings permission, it gave advisors a playbook, it gave historians a migraine, and it gave you a glimpse into how sexual power wasn't hidden under the bed. It was built into the throne itself. You pass through another door, this one smaller, less grand, and find yourself in what looks like a private prayer room. Candles flicker on a small altar. The air smells like frankincense, and the silence is almost oppressive. This is where the king knelt before battle, before coronations, before marriage. He begged for divine favour, but rarely for restraint. That part never made the list. And maybe that's what makes all this so strange. The same hands that blessed the sword and the crown were the ones adjusting silk robes after a night of betrayal. The same lips that kissed the Bible whispered sweet nothings to someone else's daughter. And the same throne that claimed divine mandate often rested on a foundation of quiet sins and loud excuses. You step back into the corridor and realise something has shifted. You no longer see kings as distant symbols. You see them as men, flawed, frightened, endlessly hungry for something they could never fully control. And the divine? Well, it might have been watching, but it sure wasn't intervening. You're standing in front of an elaborate wooden door carved with flowers, fruit, and mythological figures, exactly the kind of design that wants to distract you from whatever strange business lies behind it. This is the private retreat of Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia, and tonight you're about to get a first-hand look at how preparation for intimacy in royal palaces wasn't just emotional or strategic, it was physical, like very physical. Because long before the candles flickered and the lace robes fell to the floor, there was an entire procedure, and let's just say it was not for the squeamish. You push the door open and step into a plush room filled with mirrors and warm lamplight, probably lavender oil in the air, and rows of neatly folded linens stacked like they're preparing for surgery. This, believe it or not, is the royal cleansing chamber. And no, it's not a bathhouse. It's a space where intimacy was prepped like a battlefield. Because for some monarchs, sex didn't begin with flirtation. It began with a flush. Catherine the Great was famously meticulous about her health and appearance, but she also lived in a time when people believed cleanliness affected fertility, virility, and even political fortune. And so, before any private rendezvous, Catherine reportedly followed a regimen that would make most modern spas seem low effort. We're talking full body oil massages, steam, shaving, and enemas. Yes, enemas. The logic. A cleansed body was a pure body, more worthy of pleasure, more fit for producing heirs. And in an age without reliable hygiene, this kind of ritual was seen not as indulgent but essential. The more you think about it, the more it makes sense. Sort of. In royal palaces, every detail was symbolic. Clean skin meant clean conscience. A perfumed body meant power, and if you were about to share that body, especially as a woman, it better look, smell, and feel flawless. But it wasn't just about presentation. There were beliefs tied to bodily balance, with doctors recommending herbal purges, controlled diets, and yes, a little peppermint oil in intimate places to get things moving. Catherine, like many of her royal peers, lived in a world obsessed with humours, the ancient medical idea that your body was made up of 4 liquids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And if you were off balance, expect a prescription of leeches or a bowel cleanse. This extended into sexuality too. If you weren't conceiving, it might be because your internal heat was too strong, or your blood was stagnant. Cue the enemas and the goose fat ointments. Here's your fringe fact for the night. Catherine's personal physicians actually kept records of her physical and emotional state before and after romantic encounters. Not because they were weirdly nosy, though maybe a little, but because royal health was state health. If she wasn't in top condition, politically or physically, Russia's stability could be questioned. So if she was meeting a lover, or considering a new one, her advisors wanted to be sure she was prepared. The level of micromanagement is both absurd and completely in character for the way royal courts handled sex. Performative, invasive, and always, always watched. Now, Catherine's reputation in the modern world is tangled in rumour and myth, some of it ridiculous, like the infamous and false story involving a horse, which was pure slander cooked up long after her death. But what is true is that she had several lovers throughout her life, and she managed those relationships with incredible precision. Her favourites were often promoted, given titles or land, and then quietly retired with pensions once the spark faded. It sounds cold, but remember, Catherine was ruling a vast empire surrounded by political enemies. Love wasn't a luxury, it was a calculated risk, and her body, that was another part of the empire she had to manage. You step into a second chamber, a kind of boudoir, with low couches and painted ceilings, and imagine her waiting here, robed in silk, hair coiled just so, already having gone through an hour of physical prep. The linens are fresh, the air is scented, and somewhere, probably nearby, a physician is taking notes. It's not sexy in the way movies try to make it. It's clinical, strategic, maybe a little exhausting. But this was the price of royal intimacy. You didn't just show up. You presented yourself. You became the embodiment of power, sensuality, and control. Historians still debate just how orchestrated Catherine's relationships were. Some believe her heart played a larger role than she admitted. Others see her lovers as little more than favoured courtiers, political tools in velvet pants. But there's no question that the preparation was part of the performance, and this wasn't unique to her. Many royals, especially women, were trained to treat sex as ritual, something to be entered into with poise, not spontaneity. And that leads you to a strange realization. For all the scandals we associate with royal bedrooms, the lead-up was often far from passionate. It was methodical, scripted, sometimes painfully so. In fact, spontaneity was often seen as vulgar. The best royal affairs were controlled, planned, supervised, and free of complications like actual emotion. Love could mess with judgment, but a properly managed affair, that was just good governance. You pause in front of a gilded mirror, the kind designed to flatter even the worst angles, and you wonder how many women stood here before their appointment, checking every detail, hoping they looked desirable enough to keep their place, and safe enough to leave it with dignity. For some, a night with the monarch was promotion. For others, it was a sentence. One wrinkle, one misstep, and you could find yourself sent away with nothing but rumours trailing behind. And yet, despite the pressure, the scrutiny, the absurd hygiene routines, some royals did find intimacy in all the madness. Catherine wrote letters to her lovers that were passionate, clever, sometimes even playful. There was still space, however small, for real connection. Even under the weight of expectation, people found ways to feel. You leave the chamber behind, the scent of oil and powder still in your nose, and realise you've just walked through a different kind of battlefield. Not one of swords and blood, but of preparation and perception. Where sex wasn't spontaneous or sacred, it was staged. And if you didn't perform it correctly, you didn't just lose the room, you could lose your future. You're deeper in now, beyond the velvet chambers and formal corridors, through a narrow stone passage that smells faintly of ash and perfume. It shouldn't even be here. This part isn't on the palace tours, and no painting ever dares show it. But it existed in more than one royal court. Hidden brothels, private tunnels, secret rooms in the palace itself where sex was not ceremonial, not political, not even sanctioned by etiquette, but raw, transactional, and in many ways more honest than anything upstairs. Because sometimes the people with the most power needed their desires not fulfilled but forgotten. The first time you hear about these rooms, they sound like rumours, whispers from servants, the kind of story you'd expect from jealous courtiers or disgraced guards. But over and over again, in different countries and eras, the same patterns emerge. Hidden spaces for illicit encounters, paid, sometimes coerced, often ignored, and often only a few paces from where laws were written and kings knelt in prayer. Let's start with France again, because of course. Versailles was a glittering lie in many ways, and while the salons and ballrooms shimmered with elegance, there were doors behind doors. Louis XV, known for his religious upbringing and polished image, maintained a space called the Parc aux Cerfs. We touched on it earlier, but it bears repeating. This wasn't a gentleman's affair with mistresses. It was an operation. A house stocked with young women, some barely into their teens, brought in discreetly and rotated out once the king grew bored, or they became inconvenient. Most were paid. Some weren't old enough to understand what was happening, and the court knew. Everyone whispered, everyone speculated, but no one stopped it. Why? Because a king's pleasure was considered untouchable. As long as the line of succession stayed clean, what happened behind unmarked doors didn't matter, and that's the dark truth of power. It creates spaces where accountability vanishes. Now take that model and multiply it. You begin to notice how many palaces had these in-between places. In the Ottoman Empire, it was literal. The imperial harem, tucked inside Topkapi Palace, was a fortress of courtesans and concubines, guarded by eunuchs, ruled by hierarchy. It wasn't just a space for pleasure, it was a political engine, a web of influence controlled by women who wielded more behind-the-scenes power than most ministers. But make no mistake, it was still a system built on captivity and surveillance, even if some rose to real influence. Europe had no monopoly on shadowed pleasure. In imperial China, entire courts functioned with parallel structures. Wives, consorts, palace maids, all arranged in delicate balance around the emperor's desire. And just like in France, there were informal brothels for the lower tiers of nobility. People who didn't get official mistresses or arranged marriages but still needed outlets. And then there's the staff, the cooks, the guards, the seamstresses. They saw it all. Some of them became part of it. Servants were often coerced or outright forced into sexual relationships with royals or powerful nobles. And since they didn't have names that showed up in history books, their stories vanished. But now and then, one bubbles up. A chambermaid pregnant and mysteriously dismissed. A page boy found in the wrong hallway at the wrong time. An unexplained suicide. A forgotten letter hinting at blackmail. One fringe fact that sounds pulled from a novel but isn't. In the court of Philip II of Spain, records show a budget line for personal entertainments. And while it's never explicitly labelled as such, scholars suspect it referred to maintaining a discrete group of companions brought in from local towns, carefully selected, educated just enough to not embarrass themselves, and never allowed to speak of what happened inside the walls. And then there's the way the architecture itself told the story. Look closely, and you'll find servants' staircases that link directly to royal bedrooms, tiny one-person doors carved into grand hallways, escape routes, or perhaps entries for those not meant to be seen. In some palaces, entire wings were walled off after scandals, quiet erasures meant to protect reputations while silencing the victims. You walk through one of these hidden halls now. There's a faint trail of old perfume, the kind that clings to velvet even after centuries. A broken tile near the wall, stained in a way that doesn't look like wine. And you realise this wasn't just a secret space. It was a pressure valve. A place where desires too dark or complicated for public view were stashed away, indulged, and discarded. It was the palace's dirty conscience, scrubbed and repainted every time someone got too close. The ongoing scholarly debate is one of complicity. How much did the court really know? Were these hidden pleasure spaces tacitly approved, or were they shadow operations run by rogue aides and corrupt officials? Some argue that kings like Louis XV genuinely believed they were doing no harm. After all, the girls were paid, clothed, kept safe. Others say that's revisionist nonsense, that the whole system was rigged to exploit people who couldn't say no, and that royal courts simply chose not to care. And then there's the even darker possibility, that these spaces were preserved not in spite of royal policy, but because of it. That every unmarked door was part of the architecture of power, a quiet acknowledgement that ruling with absolute authority meant never having to confront your own appetites. You pause at the end of the hallway, where the stone becomes marble again, and light returns in golden streaks. You've left the shadow, but it doesn't leave you. You start to notice how many paintings show kings as pious, but never tired. Queens as virtuous, but never weary. You realise how much of history was written by people who stood in bright rooms, pretending the hidden ones didn't exist. And maybe that's the most unsettling truth so far. Royal palaces were built not just to impress, but to hide. For every gilded room, there was a darker one. For every celebrated romance, a transaction. And somewhere, behind every curtain, was a secret no one wanted to name. The light outside shifts now, dimming to that soft golden hour haze that makes even the stone floors look warm and welcoming. You pass back into the main wing of the palace, but you're not heading to the king's chamber this time. You're headed to hers, the queen, the one wearing the crown, holding the scepter, and navigating a world where power was sharp-edged and intimacy rarely came without strings. This is where things get even murkier, because not all royal bedrooms were ruled by kings. Some queens controlled their own narratives, others found themselves trapped in them. And then there were the courtesans. some wielding more influence than the queen herself, all while lacking the title, the ring, and sometimes the protection. You're in a room that smells faintly of rosewater and parchment. The walls are covered in tapestries showing noble women in gardens, looking serene, virtuous, and conveniently silent. But don't let the embroidery fool you. Behind those calm faces were minds calculating every glance, every whisper, every moment the king's attention drifted, even slightly, from wife to mistress, or mistress to another mistress. And if you were the queen, your status wasn't fixed. It was a job you had to defend. Picture a royal court like a battlefield in ball gowns. You had the queen on one side, expected to be the pure symbol of dynasty and divine order. Then, across from her, often sitting in the same salons, were the king's mistresses, sometimes officially titled, always unofficially powerful, and the lines between affection, strategy, and manipulation completely blurred. Take France again, because honestly, France is just doing the most in this department. Madame de Pompadour wasn't just Louis XV's mistress. She was his advisor, his confidant, and in many ways, his political partner. She helped him plan wars, censor books, and manage court appointments. The Queen, Marie Leschinska, was mostly sidelined, stuck attending mass and pretending everything was fine while her husband's lover remodelled her apartments. But Pompadour wasn't content with being just another pretty face. When her sexual relationship with the king cooled, she allegedly helped recruit new girls for him, yes, personally, so she could remain his closest companion and preserve her influence. That's not a mistress. That's an executive producer of the king's sex life, and she's far from the only one. Meanwhile, queens had limited moves. They couldn't just have lovers. That was political suicide. Any sign of infidelity, or even friendly correspondence with the wrong man, could spark rumours of treason. A queen's womb was a national asset. If there was any doubt about the paternity of a child, it wasn't just gossip. It was a dynastic crisis. So even if she was neglected, humiliated, or emotionally destroyed by her husband's affairs, the queen had to smile and keep her composure. But not all queens played it safe. Some, like Catherine de' Medici, wielded power more directly. She used marriage alliances like chess pieces, and was rumoured to dabble in dark arts just to maintain her edge. Others, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, used charm, intellect, and sheer force of personality to carve out a seat at the table, not just in bed, but in matters of war and state. And some queens did take lovers, carefully, quietly, dangerously. One of the most whispered examples, Queen Christina of Sweden. Unmarried, famously eccentric and possibly queer, she confounded her court by refusing to fit into any of the expected roles. She dressed in men's clothes, rejected the idea of marriage entirely, and surrounded herself with female companions that raised a lot of eyebrows, and probably a few heart rates. Was she truly in control of her image, or simply playing the only hand she had? Scholars are still debating it. Then there were the courtesans, the official, unofficial women who weren't royalty but lived within the palace walls, lavished with gifts, power, and influence, until they weren't. These women could shape policy with a whisper, bankrupt nobles with a smile, and destroy rivals with a single evening spent in the king's favour. But they lived on a razor's edge. One wrong move, one jealous enemy, one aging mirror reflection, and suddenly you were exiled, ruined, or worse. A particularly chilling fringe fact. Some courtesans, especially in Italian courts during the Renaissance, were rumoured to be poisoned when they became inconvenient. Not dramatically or publicly, just slow declines blamed on nerves or melancholy. That beautiful woman who used to sit beside the Duke at dinner, gone. Her name scrubbed from records, her gowns handed down to someone younger. And yet, many of these women weren't passive players. They were educated, ambitious, and fiercely aware of the stakes. The court of Louis XIV included several women who published poems, held salons, and negotiated political alliances behind the scenes, all while sleeping with men who were technically unavailable. It's a strange paradox. The queen was bound by protocol and scrutiny, while the mistress had a kind of freedom until she didn't. Historians continue to argue over who really held the power. Was it the queen with the crown, or the courtesan with the king's ear? In many cases it depended on timing, personality, and sheer luck. Some queens ruled in all but name, some mistresses became legends, and some were simply discarded footnotes in someone else's legacy. You step into the Queen's private sitting room. Quiet now, sunlight pooling across the marble floor. The space feels heavy, not with sadness, but with effort. You can almost hear the conversations that happened here. Careful, coded, edged with desperation. A queen asking her lady-in-waiting if the king stayed in her chambers the night before. A mistress laughing too loudly at dinner just to be seen. A young girl being dressed for her first audience with the king, wondering if this would be the start of her rise or the beginning of the end. And in all of it, this constant suffocating game, the one thing that was rarely allowed was simple, private intimacy. Everything was strategy. Everything was exposure. And love? If it ever did exist in these spaces, it had to hide beneath 1,000 layers of silk, ceremony and suspicion. You've left the royal wings now, slipping down a quieter hallway where the rugs are thinner, the candles fewer, and the portraits on the wall don't feature kings and queens, but nurses, governesses, and the occasional solemn-eyed child. This is the nursery wing, the place most people forget about when they imagine palace life, but where some of the most whispered stories start. Tonight, you're going to walk the line between affection and suspicion, between wet nurses and whispered affairs, and see how the business of babies in royal courts was anything but innocent. Because in these halls, every coo and cry might carry a secret. At first glance, it all seems wholesome enough. Here's the cradle, carved in ivory and lined with impossibly soft muslin. There's the nursemaid, rocking gently, humming some ancient lullaby you don't quite recognise. And over in the corner, the wet nurse, unassuming, modestly dressed, and completely indispensable. She's the one feeding the future of the nation, after all. But behind that soothing picture lies a whole web of politics, biology, and rumour. In many royal courts, breastfeeding was considered beneath a queen's station. Why? Because nursing tied her to the child physically, hormonally, and emotionally. And that meant it interrupted the one thing she was actually required to do: make more babies. The thinking went like this: nursing delayed the return of fertility. A queen who breastfed could be out of commission for a year or more. So instead, the baby was handed off to a wet nurse, often within days of birth, sometimes hours. Which brings us to the strange, silent power of these women. A wet nurse wasn't just a caretaker, she was the literal lifeline to the royal heir. She was chosen with care, often tested for health, temperament, and even her own moral character. Her diet was scrutinised, her schedule monitored, and her breasts became the subject of more royal attention than you'd believe. Because a weak or sickly heir was a national crisis, and you couldn't risk feeding them from a woman with questionable habits, or worse, questionable origins. And yet, despite all this control, the wet nurse often formed a deeper bond with the royal child than the queen herself. After all, she was the one who fed them, soothed them, slept near them. Some future kings and queens grew up referring to their wet nurse as mama, and treated their biological mother more like a distant aunt. The emotional consequences were profound. For the royal child, love was split early, confused and political from the very beginning. For the wet nurse, it was often heartbreaking. Once her services were no longer needed, she was dismissed, paid off, and sent away, occasionally with a small pension, often with nothing. Now let's step into the real shadows, because this dynamic also opened doors for rumour, sabotage, and sexual scandal. There are more than a few recorded cases of noblemen, sometimes even kings, developing romantic or sexual relationships with their children's wet nurses. She was young, healthy, present, and importantly, far lower in status, which made her both accessible and expendable. A woman who breastfed your child could also bear your next illegitimate one, and the blurred lines in these situations led to cover-ups, mysterious relocations, and sometimes very sudden illnesses. One fringe fact that still sparks debate: there's a case in 17th century Denmark where a queen's infant son died mysteriously after a change in wet nurses. The official story blamed illness, but a letter discovered decades later hinted at something more deliberate. Some suspect foul play, perhaps from a court faction hoping to shift the line of succession. No proof, just whispers. But that's often how these stories go. Even more intriguing are the cases where lovers were smuggled into the nursery. Not the kind you're thinking of, but women brought in under the guise of caretakers, only to be found out months later as the king's latest mistress. In some palaces, the nursery wing became a weird pocket of both innocence and scandal, a place where babies cried while secret affairs unfolded behind drawn curtains, where life was beginning and lies were already growing. Of course, royal children weren't always the king's, or at least not provably. If a queen did step outside her vows, and some did, it was the nursery that bore the risk. There were persistent rumours in nearly every court that one child or another didn't quite match the father. A birthmark here, a two-pointed nose there, and since most births weren't DNA tested, obviously, it was all about appearances. If the child looked enough like the monarch, the issue was dropped. If not, well, let's just say a few royal babies were sent quietly away for their health and never mentioned again. And it wasn't just the baby's appearance that got examined. Midwives and court physicians were expected to watch and record everything during labour, how long it lasted, who was in the room, whether the queen screamed unusual names. In some cases, people genuinely believed a child could be switched at birth, and to be fair, it could. In the chaos of childbirth, with dozens of attendants and servants scurrying around, all it took was one distracted moment. A royal heir swapped with a commoner's child is the kind of thing you'd expect in a novel, but there are real, documented accusations, never proven, but never quite disproven either. You wander down the corridor now, peeking into one of the smaller nurseries, this one for a younger sibling, perhaps a daughter who won't inherit anything except expectations. The room is smaller, colder, less ornate. Already the hierarchy begins to shape their lives. The boy upstairs gets the golden cradle, the girl gets the sturdy one. Both are being watched, weighed, and judged before they can even sit up. It's intimate, yes, but it's also machinery, and you realise that even in their earliest moments, royal children were props in someone else's story, used to secure alliances, justify wars, soothe dynastic fears, and the women who cared for them, truly cared, often disappeared before the first birthday, replaced by tutors, advisors, protocol, because nothing in the palace stays soft for long. The nursery door swings closed behind you with a quiet click, and the silence that follows is unnerving. You expected this part of the palace to feel warm, maternal, comforting. Instead, it feels like a factory, one where the product is a future ruler, and the costs, unspoken, forgotten, but very, very real. Now you're somewhere in between, not in the royal chambers, not among the servants, but in that strange limbo where power gets personal, the space between throne and chamber pot. You're standing outside a small but surprisingly elegant room with just one occupant, a man whose entire job was to follow the kings behind, literally. This is the realm of the groom of the stool, and yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. But before you laugh, you should know this. No one in the entire palace knew more secrets than he did. Let's back up a little. In a modern world, personal hygiene is private, but in a royal palace, even your bowel movements were a performance. Kings didn't just pop off to the restroom. They had a scheduled, assisted ritual for relieving themselves, complete with linen cloths, perfumed water, and a hand-picked official to help. The groom of the stool was that official, and for centuries, especially in Tudor England, he wasn't just some unfortunate servant. He was a powerful, deeply trusted advisor. Imagine it. You're the king, everyone lies to you, everyone flatters you, but there's this one guy who sees you first thing in the morning, before the crown goes on, when your breath smells like last night's roast and your royal stomach's making all the wrong noises. And this guy, he's wiping your butt. Literally. That kind of intimacy, it builds a weird, almost sacred trust. The position started with Henry VII and continued well into the 17th century, and it was always given to someone from the noble class, sometimes even the gentry. Not because nobles enjoyed cleaning butts, probably, but because only a man of rank could be trusted with that level of vulnerability. The groom didn't just manage the king's chamber pot, he managed his schedule, his moods, his health, his gossip. He was the first to know when the king was too ill to attend court, and sometimes the only one who knew when the king was depressed, lovesick, or suffering from too many oysters and regret. And because he was always there, always, the groom of the stool overheard everything. Late-night confessions, slurred pillow talk, medical consultations no one else was allowed to witness. If a king had a mistress sneaking in, the groom helped cover it up. If the king needed a secret note delivered to that mistress, he carried it. He knew who was in favour, who was falling out, and what diseases were circulating beneath the velvet sheets. One fringe fact that tends to shock people: some grooms of the stool ended up more powerful than cabinet ministers. Sir Anthony Denny, for example, served Henry VIII in the role, and had access to him during some of the most volatile years of his reign, including the period when Henry was lashing out at wives and advisers like a toddler with a sword. Denny used that influence to push political reform, reward allies, and keep his enemies far from the royal backside. Of course, not everyone was comfortable with the idea of royal bowel buddies. When James I took the throne, his Scottish nobles were baffled by the English obsession with this position. Some mocked it, others tried to get rid of it, but James, being James, decided to keep it, and gave the role even more political weight. He understood that trust was a currency, and when you're literally helping a monarch with the most basic of human functions, that trust turns into something far more valuable than gold. Still, the role wasn't without risk. The groom was so close to the king that if anything went wrong, an embarrassing moment, a slip of the tongue, a misjudged joke, he could fall fast. There are records of grooms being dismissed suddenly with no explanation. Some ended up in exile. Others just disappeared from history, which is its own kind of sentence. And the question that still lingers among historians is, how much power did these men really have? Were they quiet confidants or active manipulators? Did they influence decisions or just bear witness to them? The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Like modern-day fixers, they worked behind the scenes, smoothing the king's image while protecting his secrets. And sometimes, those secrets weren't about bowel habits. They were about lovers, affairs, children born of midnight visits, or tensions with queens who knew too much and spoke too often. You step into the groom's quarters, expecting something modest, but it's shockingly refined. A writing desk, a mirror, a cushioned chair. After all, he was nobility, and also had to spend hours in intimate proximity to someone with a delicate constitution and a lot of venison in his diet. Comfort mattered. And here's the thing. In a court where everyone's watching everyone else, the groom of the stool was one of the few who saw the king as just a man. Not a symbol, not a god-ordained ruler, not a distant father of the nation, but a sweating, aching human being. And that made the groom dangerous. Because if you see the flaws clearly, you also see how easy it is to manipulate them. You lean over the writing desk and spot a letter, just a copy, now faded. It's from a monarch to his groom, thanking him for discretion after a particularly humiliating bout of illness. It's brief, but you feel the weight of it. That kind of vulnerability doesn't get written down unless it really mattered. You walk away thinking about how strange it is that the palace's most powerful men weren't always the ones holding swords or signing treaties. Sometimes they were the ones holding towels, or secrets, and sometimes those were the same thing. You're moving into deeper territory now, not metaphorically, but physically. Past the grand halls, past the lesser chambers, and now down into the belly of the palace, where torches sputter on the walls, and the air has the scent of damp limestone and wax. This is the underbelly. And tonight, it's about surveillance. Not the kind with cameras and microphones, but with eyes behind curtains, ears pressed to keyholes, and lives lived entirely in the shadows. Because for all the grandeur of royal sex, someone was always watching, always listening, and often not human in the usual sense. Welcome to the strange world of eunuchs, spies, and royal pleasure guards. It sounds like a spy novel, right? Secret watchers of the king's most intimate moments. But this was very real, especially outside Europe, where the boundaries between pleasure and statecraft were far blurrier, and the palace staff more specialised. In the Ottoman Empire, for example, eunuchs were more than just guards or caretakers of the harem. They were gatekeepers of the empire's most dangerous space, the royal family's private life. You walk through a narrow arched doorway and into what would have been a eunuch's quarters, sparse but orderly. A cot, a chest, and a small copy of the Quran or Bible, depending on the court. There's a quiet dignity to the room, but also an edge, because you know what it cost to be here. Eunuchs were often enslaved as boys, castrated, usually without consent, and raised for one purpose: to serve without threat. To move between women's chambers and royal bedrooms without ever being seen as a sexual risk, which, in the warped logic of palace life, made them perfect. But here's where things get even more layered. These weren't passive servants. Some eunuchs, particularly in the Ottoman court, rose to positions of immense influence. The chief black eunuch, for instance, wasn't just a glorified doorman. He had direct access to the sultan, managed the entire harem, and often controlled massive wealth and political favours. One word from him could elevate a concubine or destroy a vizier. He was both invisible and omnipresent. And this wasn't limited to Istanbul. In Ming China, the Forbidden City was crawling with eunuchs who operated as the emperor's personal attendants and spies. They managed correspondence, delivered secret orders, and were known to manipulate palace politics with surgical precision. The emperor's intimate life, who he favoured, who he ignored, who bore him children, was all filtered through eunuchs. And while technically forbidden from interfering in politics, they often became kingmakers, a fringe fact that doesn't get enough attention. In some courts, eunuchs were paid to test the sexual performance of concubines before they were presented to the monarch. Yes, you read that right. Not actual intercourse, obviously, but inspections, rehearsals, and evaluations. It's horrifying and dehumanizing, and it shows how much intimacy in these places was commodified, practiced, and policed. Now let's shift slightly. Not every spy was a eunuch. In European courts, surveillance was handled differently, but no less effectively. Here, the watchers were often disguised as chambermaids, footmen, or ladies-in-waiting. You might be brushing the queen's hair while memorising her conversations, or straightening the king's robes while keeping track of who left his chamber at what hour. And the most dangerous of all? The confessor. That's right. The priest who heard their sins also knew their alliances, and while bound by confidentiality, let's not pretend secrets never leaked when it suited someone. You can almost hear it now. Whispers slipping through stone walls, someone breathing a little too loudly outside the queen's dressing room, a letter handed off under a wine tray. Nothing happened in isolation, and no touch was truly private. If a new mistress appeared at court, the gossip reached foreign ambassadors before the bedsheets cooled. If a queen delayed her visit to the king's chambers, it was noted in triplicate by people whose names you'll never know. This creates an eerie paradox. In the most intimate spaces of royal life, bedrooms, baths, nurseries, there was more surveillance, not less. Because that's where the stakes were highest. One lover could change policy. One child could shift the line of succession. One whispered confession could end in exile or execution. It wasn't just about protecting the monarch. It was about managing the entire system. Imagine being a young concubine summoned to the emperor's bed only to discover you're being observed. Quietly, discreetly, by attendants trained to report everything from your attitude to your fragrance. Or a queen writing a heartfelt letter to a cousin only to have it intercepted, copied and shared with half the court. You couldn't relax. You couldn't be real. Not ever. And that brings us to the debate historians still circle. Was this system of surveillance meant to protect rulers, or control them? Were eunuchs and spies defending royal privacy, or manipulating it for their own ends? There are cases on both sides. Some eunuchs stayed loyal to their monarchs for decades, helping them navigate political minefields. Others were caught taking bribes, forging documents, even influencing which concubines had access to the ruler's bed. There's something tragic in all of it. You think of power as freedom, but here, the higher you rose, the fewer moments you truly owned. Even in your own bedroom, someone was listening, and sometimes those someones were the ones with the real power. Not the king, but the man who opened his chamber door. Not the queen, but the servant who dressed her, who took her letters, who knew when she cried. You pass a narrow slit window in the corridor, barely large enough for a candle's worth of light, but wide enough, maybe, to listen through. It's quiet now, just stone and silence. But once, this place buzzed with secrets. People spoke carefully here. They knew someone might be listening. They always knew. And as you step back into the main passage, you realise that the most dangerous thing in any palace wasn't poison or betrayal or scandal. It was the truth. And someone, somewhere, was always just close enough to hear it. You're back above ground now, somewhere between the garden and the Queen's Chapel, in a quiet courtyard framed with weathered statues and overgrown rose bushes. The stillness feels like a break from everything you've just seen. No lovers slipping through doors, no chambermaids spying from shadows. But don't be fooled. Just because things seem calm doesn't mean they were. This courtyard, like everything else in the palace, was once part of the performance. And tonight, you're here to unravel something stranger than scandal, stranger even than gossip. You're going to explore the absurd, intimate, and deeply unscientific world of royal medical beliefs. Welcome to a time when sex was governed by superstition. Fertility was a matter of frog powder and moon phases, and your physician might prescribe an orgasm to fix your complexion. You sit on a stone bench beneath a twisted old tree and try to imagine what it was like to be a royal couple expected to produce an heir, but with no real understanding of how the human body worked. It's the 15th or 16th century, and you've been married for a year. No baby yet. People are starting to murmur. The pressure builds, and the royal physician is summoned, not to examine you, but to diagnose the stars. That's right. Before even checking your body, they're charting your horoscope. Maybe Venus is in a bad house. Maybe Saturn's being an absolute jerk. Either way, you're told to try again, but only on Tuesdays, and only after applying a paste of crushed pearls and herbs to your inner thighs. That's not an exaggeration. Royal medicine was a circus of ritual and guesswork, especially when it came to sex and fertility. One fringe remedy recorded in a 17th century Italian court involved boiling rose petals, cinnamon, goat bile, and powdered frog skeleton into a paste, then rubbing it onto the lower abdomen while chanting a fertility prayer. Was it effective? Obviously not. But it made people feel like they were doing something, and that's often all a court needed to believe. And while we're here, let's talk about sympathetic magic. The idea was that your body could be influenced by symbols, shapes, and objects. So a royal couple trying to conceive might sleep with a carved wooden baby under the bed, or tie knots in silk cords to lock fertility into the womb, or be told not to make love during certain lunar phases, because the moon could make the baby deformed or, worse, rebellious. Seriously, these beliefs weren't fringe in their time. They were medical facts, at least according to the best minds available. For women, especially queens, the pressure was crushing. If you didn't conceive quickly, people assumed you were cursed, barren, or, ironically, too lustful. The body was a battlefield of contradiction. Too much desire could overheat the womb. Not enough meant it stayed dormant. And so physicians prescribed things like warm milk enemas, massage with animal fat, and exposure to stimulating fragrances like musk or ambergris. Candles shaped like male anatomy were a thing. You're starting to get the idea. For men, it wasn't much better. Royal physicians often focused on vital humours, those 4 mysterious bodily fluids. And if you were deemed too melancholic or phlegmatic, you might be told to avoid sex entirely for a season, or to have more sex, or to drink mulled wine with crushed antlers in it to ignite the spark. King Charles II of England reportedly consumed a daily tonic made from pulverised human skull. Not for sex, necessarily, but it paints a picture of what passed for science in these circles. One particularly wild historical footnote: in Renaissance France, a group of midwives believed that sneezing after sex could help a woman conceive. The idea was that the sneeze pushed the seed upward. This led to noble women stuffing themselves with pepper and tilting their heads back post-coitus. There are letters. You can't make this up. And yet, in all this chaos, there's an eerie kind of sincerity. These people wanted children. They wanted love. They just didn't know what worked, and they were trapped in a world where failure meant not just personal disappointment, but national instability. A barren queen could be replaced. A king who couldn't perform was whispered about in foreign courts like a weak stallion. Entire wars were fought over inheritance, and that inheritance began in the bedroom. No pressure. Which brings us to the really uncomfortable part, the testing. In some cases, royal physicians tried to verify fertility through invasive, embarrassing procedures. Women were given vaginal steam treatments, or observed mid-cycle to see if their humours were aligned. Men were asked to ejaculate into cloth and have it inspected for quality. Again, no one really knew what they were looking for, but it didn't stop them from assigning blame. That blame usually landed on the woman. Even if the king was obviously impotent, courtiers would bend logic backward to protect his reputation. Maybe the queen's womb was too cold. Maybe her uterus was tilted. Maybe she was possessed. Exorcisms weren't common, but they did happen. You're suddenly appreciating modern medicine in a way you never thought possible. Historians still debate just how much of this was believed versus performed. Were physicians just telling royals what they wanted to hear? Was the ritual itself the point, regardless of the result? Some scholars argue that the ceremonies, pastes, prayers, moon cycles, were less about results and more about creating a sense of control in a world where biology was unpredictable, and so much was riding on a successful pregnancy. You rise from the bench and walk along the edge of the garden, where medicinal herbs used to grow: lavender for calm, rue for protection, pomegranate seeds for fertility. A young queen might have strolled here, clutching a talisman, sipping a chalky tonic, praying silently that this month would be the one. The handmaidens smiling politely, her physician nodding gravely, all of them part of a system that knew everything about power and almost nothing about reproduction. The sun dips lower, and the shadows stretch long across the cobblestones. You glance back at the doorway you came from, suddenly aware that you're standing where generations tried, desperately, earnestly, often absurdly, to make sense of something they barely understood. It wasn't just about sex, it was about meaning, about hope, about legacy, and sometimes about powdered frogs. You're back inside now, walking slowly through a quiet corridor where the light filters through thin, coloured glass and pools across polished stone in pale, diluted reds and blues. It's soft, almost too delicate for a palace that's been full of scandal and surveillance. But don't let the quiet fool you. Tonight, you're entering one of the most dangerous rooms in the whole palace. Not the throne room or the war chamber, but the marriage bed. Specifically, the myth of the maidenhead, the obsession with virginity, the blood, the sheets, the endless scrutiny, and the centuries of damage that followed. Let's start with the basic lie. The idea that a woman's virginity could be proven, that you could just check, like verifying a gemstone or authenticating a signature. In royal courts, this wasn't just folklore, it was protocol. Queens, noblewomen, even brides of minor aristocrats were expected to come into marriage untouched, and they were often examined for it. Yes, examined. By court-appointed midwives, dowagers, or trusted female relatives. They would assess the state of the woman's hymen, look for tightness, and sometimes even smell her breath, because apparently purity had a scent. It's horrifying and pseudoscientific, and it wasn't even reliable. The hymen is a flexible membrane that can stretch or tear from all sorts of things: riding, dancing, even stretching the wrong way. Some women were born with barely one at all. Others had thick hymens that didn't tear until childbirth. But that didn't matter to history. The myth persisted, and it ruined lives. You step into a bedchamber now, not royal, but grand. The kind that might have belonged to a high-ranking noblewoman. The sheets are crisp, the bed massive. But the real story played out the next morning. In many courts, the bridal bed had to be examined after the wedding night for proof of consummation. If blood was found on the sheets, it meant the bride was a virgin and the marriage valid. If not, well, that's when things got dangerous. There are recorded cases where bedsheets were paraded through the streets to confirm a noblewoman's virtue. One particularly brutal example comes from 15th century Spain, where a royal bride's family was accused of deception after the sheets showed no blood. The scandal rocked the court. Rumours of annulment spread. The queen was publicly humiliated. And none of it mattered that her new husband was, according to every witness, so drunk he might not have noticed if she'd been a dragon. Sometimes brides were clever. There are accounts of women pricking their fingers or thighs to stain the sheets if they feared the worst. Some even paid servants to plant blood in advance. And can you blame them? Their reputations, dowries, and sometimes their very lives depended on that one moment, whether or not it was real. One fringe fact from Renaissance Italy: a noblewoman, accused of not being a virgin on her wedding night, reportedly underwent a second virginity test, in which she had to run naked across a cold marble floor. The belief was that only a virgin would tremble modestly and resist exposure, and yes, this was conducted by a panel of older women, most of whom likely didn't blink. Because modesty, in this context, wasn't natural. It was weaponized. But why was virginity so critical? In royal terms, it came down to property. A woman's body was part of her dowry. If she wasn't intact, she was considered damaged goods, unreliable, unclean, even politically dangerous. And in the context of producing heirs, this got even uglier. If a queen wasn't a virgin at marriage, how could anyone be sure her first child belonged to the king? This obsession with bloodlines created a paranoia that trickled into every part of palace life. Even love letters were scrutinized for too much affection, lest they hint at premarital experience. For men, of course, none of this applied. princes weren't expected to arrive at the altar untouched. In fact, the opposite was often encouraged. The young man with mistresses was seen as virile, worldly, prepared. But a woman? She had to be innocent and somehow also seductive. The perfect mix of saint and temptress. History was not kind in this department, and here's where things start to blend with legend. There are multiple stories of queens being declared false virgins and sent to convents or executed. Anne Boleyn, for example, was accused of all manner of crimes during her fall, including infidelity before her marriage to Henry VIII, though there's little evidence. But once the seed of suspicion is planted, it grows fast. People believed what they wanted to believe, especially if it served a political purpose. There's also the famous debate around Marie Antoinette's wedding night. She was married young to Louis XVI, and their marriage remained unconsummated for years. People speculated wildly. Was she frigid? Was he impotent? Was the Queen too experienced, too cold, too French? Never mind that the real issue might have been simple sexual inexperience and overwhelming pressure. The lack of evidence created a narrative vacuum that filled with scandal. You stop at the edge of the bed and picture it. A girl of 16, barely understanding what's expected of her, lying awake while the court holds its breath. Not for love, not for comfort, but for proof. A spot of red on linen to determine the fate of her marriage and by extension the stability of a kingdom. And it's not just about the women. This obsession with purity twisted intimacy for everyone. Kings were conditioned to expect passivity and fear, told that any sign of enjoyment might mean their bride wasn't truly innocent, which led to disastrous first nights, which led to more suspicion, which led to annulments, accusations and ruined reputations. Even today, historians argue over how much was real. Did queens really face such brutal tests? Or were these rituals exaggerated? Formalities meant more to satisfy tradition than scientific inquiry. The truth likely varies from court to court, but one thing's certain. The myth of the Maidenhead did real damage, and it lingers quietly in the way we still talk about sex, purity and value. You glance back at the bed, perfect, untouched, waiting. You wonder how many lives it shaped, how many nights ended in fear instead of affection, how many futures were decided by a lie dressed in silk. The hall you're walking now is quiet, quieter than it should be. The torches along the stone walls burn low, casting long, lean shadows across the floor like fingers stretching in the dark. You're in one of those wings of the palace that doesn't appear on the official tour. No grand portraits, no velvet ropes. Just a worn corridor that leads to locked doors and half-told stories. This is the part of the palace that belonged to people who never really fit. The kings who didn't desire their queens, the queens who secretly adored someone else, and the lovers history refused to name out loud. Tonight, you're going to meet the celibate kings and the closet queens, the ones who played the part by day and vanished into themselves by night. You might think of monarchs as sex-obsessed. History certainly makes it seem that way. But for every Louis or Henry with a dozen mistresses, there were kings who simply weren't interested, or not in that way. And in a court where every eye was watching, that kind of disinterest could be more scandalous than an affair. You couldn't just say no, not when your entire reign depended on heirs, on appearances, on satisfying the unspoken expectations of masculinity. Start with King Edward VI of England, the sickly son of Henry VIII. He died before reaching adulthood, but even as a teenager, rumours swirled about his aversion to women. Too pious, some said, too shy. Others speculated there was more to it, a quiet discomfort with the marriage bed he was never forced into, but always loomed over his future. History never gave him the chance to choose, but the whispers remain. Then there's King James I of England, more well documented and far less ambiguous. Married, yes. With children, yes. But his real passions, according to most surviving letters and accounts, were reserved for his male favourites. George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, was the most notable, described in personal letters with a tenderness and familiarity that raised eyebrows even then. "I desire only to live in your heart," James once wrote to him. "I had rather live banished in your company than in England without you." It's not coded, it's intimate. And yet, history tends to shove these sentiments into footnotes, as if they were just poetic. James isn't alone. Queen Christina of Sweden, whose name you've heard before, renounced marriage entirely, dressed in men's clothing, and surrounded herself with female companions. Her refusal to play the role of queenly wife sent shockwaves through Europe. She eventually abdicated her throne and converted to Catholicism, living the rest of her life abroad, her sexuality still debated centuries later. Was she lesbian, asexual, transgender before the word existed? The records offer clues but no conclusions. Scholars still argue, but one thing is certain: she did not conform, and the court couldn't handle it. In the French court, King Henri III preferred the company of his mignons, young, fashionable male courtiers who followed him like a glittering entourage. They were ridiculed for their appearance, their perfume, their lace. Caricatures from the time mock Henri as effeminate, too delicate for rule. And that wasn't just homophobia, it was political. To his enemies, a king who didn't pursue women was weak. A king without mistresses was a king who couldn't lead. Never mind his actual policies, his bedroom defined his reputation. Even more subtly, you find queens who played their roles with perfect poise, while quietly rewriting the script. Marie-Louise of Orleans, the Spanish queen consort, was so miserable in her marriage to Charles II, himself possibly impotent or infertile, that she reportedly turned to the comfort of her ladies-in-waiting. There's no proof of physical relationships, just an intense emotional reliance, long walks in private gardens, and a refusal to spend time with her husband, which in palace terms was revolutionary. Here's a fringe fact that feels almost too modern. In the 18th century there were coded slang terms in French used at court to describe men who loved other men. Sodomites, yes, but also more playful terms like chevalier de la table ronde. These weren't always used as insults. Sometimes they were whispered with a kind of knowing acceptance. Royalty protected their own, as long as you didn't make it too obvious, as long as the heirs arrived, as long as the marriage stood, which leads to the most painful paradox. Many of these closeted monarchs did marry. Some had children. They played their roles perfectly, while hiding their truest selves behind silks and smiles. Because deviation wasn't just socially unacceptable, it was politically lethal. A king suspected of being unmanly could lose support. A queen who rejected men could be accused of witchcraft or seduction. And so they performed, day after day, year after year. You're standing now in what was once a private study, walls lined with books, a lone window looking out over a courtyard that's long been swallowed by vines. On the desk, a faded letter. Fictional maybe, but imagine it. A king writing to his closest friend, not his wife, not his advisor, but the man who knew him best. They see the crown, not the weight, it might say. They see the air, not the hollow. You start to realise that the palaces weren't just stages, they were prisons, in ways that glitter couldn't cover. For kings and queens who didn't desire in the way they were expected to, every smile was calculated, every wedding a negotiation, every night spent beside a spouse they didn't love, an act of quiet survival. And historians are still catching up. For centuries these stories were erased, softened or twisted into harmless anecdotes. But the truth is there, hiding in letters, in records of who visited whose chambers, in exiles that were never fully explained. Behind every official portrait is a person, and behind many of those people was a love or a longing that history refused to honour. You leave the study walking slowly, quietly, as if not to disturb something that might still be mourning in the walls. You've seen kings who couldn't perform, queens who refused to pretend, and lovers who had no names. And in that silence there's a kind of defiance, a reminder that even in the most controlled places on earth, some hearts still beat for themselves. You step out into the open air again, this time into one of the smaller palace courtyards where ivy climbs the stone, and the fountains trickle just loud enough to drown out conversation. The place has the strange calm of a battlefield long after the fighting's done, and maybe that's exactly what it is. Because tonight you're diving into the most dangerous kind of bedroom politics, the kind where desire becomes a weapon, where lust and love are tangled with power, betrayal, and sometimes murder. This is the realm of dangerous women and deadly desires. Welcome to the part of the story with poisoned rings, lethal lipstick, and more than a few broken hearts buried under marble floors. You've met the queens, the mistresses, the servants and spies. But not all women at court played by the rules of seduction and subtlety. Some took matters into their own hands, literally. They knew that in a palace built on male power, the body was often their only currency. and they used it like a dagger. Take the court of the Medici in Renaissance Florence, where one of the most whispered names was Bianca Capello. Originally a Venetian noblewoman, Bianca seduced Francesco de' Medici, Grand Duke of Tuscany, and eventually married him. But her sudden rise and strange influence sent shockwaves through the court. Her enemies accused her of using potions to control him, aphrodisiacs, love charms, even hallucinogens hidden in wine. And when Francesco and Bianca both died suddenly, people didn't buy the natural causes explanation for a second. Modern tests years later suggested arsenic poisoning. Whether they were victims or culprits, no one knows. The entire affair reads like a novella soaked in perfume and venom. And speaking of poison, let's talk about lipstick. Yes, lipstick. In the court of Louis XIV, it was rumoured that certain mistresses used a crimson cosmetic laced with white lead and belladonna. The lead gave it that pale shimmer so fashionable at the time. The belladonna? It dilated the pupils, giving the wearer a wide-eyed, innocent look. Beautiful, seductive, and slowly toxic. Some women wore it daily. Some used it less innocently. Rumour has it, a kiss could deliver a death sentence. Again, no definitive proof. But the fact that the court believed it? That's telling enough. One fringe fact that actually is real. In Catherine de' Medici's court, a secret laboratory existed beneath the palace. Yes, an actual underground space for alchemical experiments, perfumes, and possibly poisons. Catherine was deeply fascinated by astrology and chemical science. She employed personal perfumers who were also suspected poisoners. One of them, René the Florentine, was rumoured to concoct everything from love potions to fatal tinctures for clients who needed a little help with succession. And Catherine herself, she carried poison in her rings. Whether for protection or punishment, we'll never know. But not every deadly desire ended in blood. Some destroyed reputations instead, quietly, elegantly, and permanently. In the Russian court, women were trained in the art of seduction and psychological warfare. One noblewoman, known only through court letters as the Black Widow of St. Petersburg, reportedly seduced two high-ranking courtiers into duelling each other to the death. She showed up at the funeral of the loser wearing black lace and a pearl smile, and left with the survivor's estate in her name. Nothing illegal, just carefully sharpened charm. And it wasn't just women weaponizing desire. Some kings used sex to destroy their enemies, either by sleeping with their wives or framing them for it. Henry VIII, in his spiral toward madness, accused Anne Boleyn of seducing not one, but multiple men, one of them her own brother. The charges were likely false, designed to remove her so he could remarry. But it shows how easily sexuality could be twisted into a blade. One accusation, one whisper, that was all it took. Historians still argue over how much of this was real and how much was legend, especially in courts obsessed with storytelling. But even the rumours mattered. If people believed you were dangerous, you were. If they thought your perfume was laced with poison, they avoided you. If your smile made powerful men fight, your value skyrocketed. Reputation wasn't just currency in these palaces, it was armour, or a loaded weapon. You stop in front of a statue in the garden, some long-dead duchess forever cast in marble, staring wistfully at a rose that's long since wilted. But behind her serene expression, you can almost hear the gears turning. Maybe she was a seductress, maybe a survivor, maybe both. That's the thing about palace women. They were rarely what they seemed. A soft voice might hide a steel will, a fluttering fan might signal the beginning of a plot. And here's the paradox that still haunts historians. Were these women victims of a cruel system, or masters of it? Did they use poison and seduction because it was the only power they had, or because they liked the taste of control? Some argue that palace life forced women to become manipulative. Others believe it simply revealed their brilliance in a system that gave them few tools beyond their bodies and their wit. Either way, their names echo: Lucrezia Borgia, Diane de Poitiers, Madame de Montespan. Women who weren't content to wait on the sidelines while men decided their fates. Women who understood that in a world ruled by kings, sometimes the best move was to step into the fire in silk gloves and set your own match. You start to head back inside, the wind tugging lightly at your sleeves. There's something thrilling and terrifying about what you've just learned. That love in a palace could kill as easily as it could crown. that a whispered promise could carry a hidden blade. That lust, when pushed hard enough, doesn't just break hearts, it breaks empires. The palace is different at night. Quieter, yes, but not calm. The silence feels intentional, like something's being withheld. You pass through a long gallery where moonlight spills in from tall arched windows, casting a silver glow across portraits that don't quite meet your eyes. The chandeliers above don't sparkle. They loom. You're walking into one of the palace's most haunting legacies, a story whispered through generations, always denied in public but kept alive behind closed doors. This is the story of royal births, and the babies who might not have been who they claimed to be. Welcome to the world of baby-swapping conspiracies. You wouldn't think a birth could bring so much suspicion. It should be simple. A queen gives birth, the child is announced, the dynasty continues. But in a royal palace, nothing is simple. A baby isn't just a baby. It's a future crown, a treaty, a threat. And because so much power is tied to that tiny squirming bundle, people start asking dangerous questions. What if the child is stillborn? What if it's the wrong sex? What if it isn't the king's at all? What then? Well, sometimes a switch is made. Start with one of the most infamous rumours in French history, the tale of Louis XVII. During the French Revolution, after Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were executed, their young son, just 8 years old, was imprisoned in the Temple Tower. There, he was kept in isolation, neglected, and eventually declared dead. But no one saw the body. No official autopsy was published. And not long after, whispers began that the real boy had been smuggled out, that a dying orphan was swapped in his place, that the rightful heir to the French throne had grown up in secret, waiting for his moment to reclaim what was his. Over 100 men eventually claimed to be him. One even convinced a few nobles. DNA testing centuries later confirmed the child in the tomb was likely Louis XVII. But the myth still refuses to die. It's not the only one. Jump over to Russia, where the Romanov family was famously executed in 1918. For years, no one could confirm whether all the children had died, and then came Anastasia, or rather, Anna Anderson, a woman who appeared in Germany, claiming to be the lost Grand Duchess. She said she had survived the execution, been rescued, and hidden for years. Some believed her, staunchly, emotionally. Others didn't. She never fully convinced the Romanov relatives, and though DNA evidence eventually disproved her claim, her story inspired decades of books, films, and speculation. Again, the myth lives longer than the truth. But these stories didn't begin with revolutions. Baby-switching rumours have been crawling around palaces for centuries, long before bullets and Bolsheviks. Take the case of James Francis Edward Stuart, known as the Old Pretender. Born to James II of England and Mary of Modena in 1688, his legitimacy was immediately questioned. Why? Because he was born in secret. No witnesses from the Protestant court were allowed in. Rumours swirled that a stillborn child had been replaced with a healthy one, smuggled into the birthing chamber in a warming pan. A literal pan, as if royal heirs were some kind of souffle. It was likely nonsense, but the story gained traction and was used as justification to depose James II in the Glorious Revolution. A baby swap changed the monarchy. Why did these stories flourish? Simple. Royal births were high-stakes moments wrapped in secrecy. Most deliveries happened behind locked doors, with only select ladies, physicians, or midwives allowed inside. No men, no observers, no cameras. So much rode on trust, and there was very little of that in royal courts. Every rival faction had something to gain from casting doubt. Was the Queen truly pregnant? Had she miscarried? Did she adopt a servant's baby and pass it off as her own? Without evidence, everything was up for debate. Here's your fringe fact. In 16th century Spain, midwives were sometimes required to testify under oath about the condition of royal newborns. Not just whether they were healthy, but whether they were male. Because a queen who delivered a girl might be tempted to, let's say, adjust the facts before word got out. There's even a tale, unconfirmed but widely repeated, of a boy and girl being born to the same mother, with the girl shown to the court while the boy was hidden for a few hours, long enough to create confusion and perhaps a tactical switch. Real? Who knows? But plausible? Very. And it wasn't always about gender. Sometimes it was about parentage. In an age without paternity tests, the line between heir and imposter was terrifyingly easy to blur. What if the queen had a lover? What if the child bore a suspicious resemblance to a foreign courtier or a royal musician? You think that sounds paranoid, but these were real fears. There are letters between ambassadors from the 1700s that express serious concern over royal babies' facial features. "The nose appears unfamiliar," one wrote. "Imagine your future crumbling because of your baby's nose." Historians still debate whether any of these switches really happened. Some say they're pure fantasy, made up by political enemies or fueled by grief. Others argue that at least one must have been real, because the stakes were too high for temptation not to win at least once. After all, if you're a queen, and you lose your baby after years of pressure to produce an heir, and your husband is already eyeing someone younger, do you risk everything, or do you quietly accept a gift from a loyal servant who just had a baby of her own? You walk now into a chamber lined with tapestries, swaddling cloths from royal births, stitched with family crests and floral motifs. One has faded so much you can barely make out the initials. But it's there, clinging to the past like it still holds a secret. You wonder who wrapped it, whose tiny body it held, and whether that child was really who the world was told they were. Because in the palaces of history, truth was often the first thing to be bundled up, hidden, and carried out the back door. The mood shifts again as you leave the ghostly hush of the royal nursery behind and follow a marble path that winds past a series of elaborate balconies. You're in the diplomatic wing now, or at least the part of the palace that might as well have been built for the performance of foreign relations. Think ballrooms, throne rooms, grand corridors decked with tapestries stitched in 3 languages. But beneath the surface glitter you'll find another kind of stage, one that wasn't lit with chandeliers but with flickering candlelight in private rooms. Because behind every royal marriage forged for peace, trade, or alliance was someone who got the short end of the mattress. Tonight we're talking about imported lovers and exiled wives. You reach a wide doorway flanked by marble busts of stoic queens you've never heard of. That's kind of the point. They were the ones married off across borders, dropped into foreign courts like chess pieces, and expected to thrive under impossible circumstances. These weren't love matches. They were treaties with tiaras. And if you think the bedroom was a safe space in these arrangements, think again. Imagine you're 15, maybe 16. You've just travelled hundreds of miles to marry a man you've never met, one who doesn't speak your language, who smells like foreign spices and disappointment, and who makes it clear from the moment you meet that you're a duty, not desire. You're the Spanish infanta sent to a French court, or the Austrian archduchess carted off to Russia. You don't understand the court customs. You wear the wrong fabrics. You bring your own priest, which offends their bishop. And now you're expected to produce a son within the year, or risk being replaced. Let's start with one of the more famous cautionary tales, Catherine of Aragon. She was originally married to Arthur, Prince of Wales, and after his death, married his brother, who would become Henry VIII. It was a political move, meant to keep the alliance with Spain intact. But when Catherine failed to provide a surviving male heir, Henry tried to have the marriage annulled. The process dragged on for years, and she was increasingly isolated, discarded like a pawn that had outlived its usefulness. Her bedroom became her prison. Her letters, some of which still survive, tell of a woman desperately trying to cling to dignity while being pushed out of the narrative by younger flesh and royal impatience. This wasn't rare. Royal women brought into foreign courts were expected to assimilate immediately, but still represent the interests of their home countries. It was a tightrope walk across boiling lava. Be French enough to charm the court, but Spanish enough to secure your father's approval. Be fertile, faithful, charming, and above all, silent. Unless, of course, your husband couldn't stand the sight of you. Then your silence would be used against you. Here's a fringe fact you probably haven't heard. One Habsburg princess reportedly arrived in Paris with a full court of musicians, cooks, and ladies-in-waiting, none of whom spoke French. The French nobles mocked her constantly, accusing her of being stiff, joyless, and cold. She responded by retreating entirely into her rooms, speaking only to her dog, who also had a translator. Whether or not the story is true, it illustrates something important. These women were trapped between expectations and hostility. Even their pets were suspect, and while queens were required to remain faithful, their husbands had no such obligations. Which brings us to the gardeners, and the tutors, and the stable boys. Because in many of these lonely arranged marriages, the queen eventually looked elsewhere for what her husband withheld. It was dangerous, sometimes fatal, but it happened. And when it did, the punishment was swift. Think of Anne Boleyn again, accused of adultery, incest and treason, most of it likely false. But the rumours stuck because she was foreign to the court in spirit, if not in blood. A woman who didn't know her place, who seduced upward, who didn't come pre-installed with international treaties, and who didn't wait to be desired, she demanded to be. The idea of the wandering queen isn't just romantic fantasy, it's political theatre. If a queen was caught with a lover, it wasn't just a scandal, it was treason. Because the child she might bear could upend the line of succession, which meant even a whisper of infidelity had to be met with iron consequences. Men were tortured, women were locked away, and the ones who got lucky were simply sent home, never to be spoken of again. But there were exceptions. Some queens did get away with it. They formed discreet bonds with trusted men, usually low-ranking enough to be ignored, but smart enough to stay quiet. One French queen had a confessor who spent an awful lot of time in her private apartments. Another employed a personal painter who was never seen leaving before dawn. Were these friendships? Maybe. Were they more? Almost definitely. But in a court full of eyes, the only thing that mattered was whether you left behind evidence, or children. One of the more persistent scholarly debates is whether these affairs were acts of rebellion or survival. Was the queen trying to reclaim agency, or simply find comfort in a life designed to control her every breath? Either way, these secret relationships often led to exile. Some queens were sent to remote castles, stripped of titles, their names erased from official records. Others were cloistered in convents, where their only remaining luxury was a small garden and a Bible. You walk now into a long gallery filled with portraits of foreign queens. Some smile faintly, others stare forward with unsettling stillness. Their dresses are perfect, their jewels heavy, but their eyes, you can't stop looking at their eyes. There's longing there, maybe loneliness, maybe rage, maybe both. And here's the part no one talks about. Sometimes the king wasn't just disinterested in his queen. He was obsessed with someone else, a mistress, a courtier, a soldier, and the queen had to smile through it all, show up at ceremonies, hold his hand in public while watching him parade affection for someone else in private. It wasn't just heartbreak, it was humiliation baked into protocol. You stop at the end of the hall, in front of a portrait that's different from the others. It shows a queen standing alone in a garden, her hands folded, her face unreadable. Behind her, barely visible through the trees, is a figure in shadows, not quite approaching, not quite retreating. The painter never identified him. And maybe that's the most fitting metaphor. The lovers who didn't belong, the wives who were sent away, the stories that hover at the edge of history, blurry but real, no names, no endings, just the knowledge that even in the most gilded cages hearts tried to fly, and sometimes they didn't come back. The corridor narrows as you descend into a wing of the palace that smells faintly of wax and incense, the air cooler, heavier somehow. The stone under your feet is smooth, worn by the boots of centuries, and the silence here is a different kind, dense, devout. You're entering the religious side of the royal household, the part of the palace that tries very hard to pretend it's untouched by everything else. But we both know better, because tonight we're diving into the complicated, deeply weird world of monks, myths, and masturbation rules, where sexuality met sanctity, and everyone pretended they weren't thinking what they were obviously thinking. You step into a chapel, not one of the grand ones. This one's small, reserved for private devotion, the kind of place where a queen might kneel in penance after giving birth, or a king might sit pretending to meditate while planning his next seduction. The walls are painted with faded frescoes of saints and martyrs, all cast down or looking up in pain and ecstasy. It's honestly hard to tell which. That ambiguity was kind of the point. Let's talk about monks first. You'd think they'd be removed from this narrative, celibate, cloistered, locked away in their quiet cells reading scripture and eating boiled root vegetables. But no, monks played a significant role in royal sexual culture. Not because they participated, well, not officially, but because they policed. Monks advised kings and queens on what was sinful, what was acceptable, and what counted as a violation of God's law. Unfortunately, most of their advice was based on some of the most bizarre pseudo-medical and theological nonsense you've ever heard. Take the medieval belief that seed was finite, that men had only so much of it, and every time they released it, through sex or worse by themselves, they were draining their life force. A royal prince caught pleasuring himself might be scolded not just for sin but for wasting future heirs. This was seen as both spiritual failure and a threat to national stability. Talk about pressure. One fringe fact that sounds fake but isn't. Some religious advisors warned kings against having sex with their wives while she was menstruating, because it would result in demon-possessed children. Yep. And if a queen became pregnant while in a sinful state, read, enjoying herself too much, the child might be born with deformities, or, worse, rebellious tendencies. You think royal paranoia was bad before? Imagine blaming your teenage heir's mood swings on a steamy night 15 years ago. Monks were obsessed with purity. They issued endless pamphlets on acceptable bedroom behaviour, many of which were quietly kept in royal libraries. These weren't manuals of pleasure, they were warning labels. Positions were discussed. Spoiler, most were condemned. Frequency was regulated, and any sex not specifically for procreation was deeply frowned upon. And yet, royals still did it, often, in all the ways they were told not to. So where did that leave the palace? In an endless cycle of sin, confession, and very specific guilt. Kings would sleep with mistresses all night and then fast and pray all morning. Queens who failed to conceive would be advised to purify themselves with weeks of abstinence, then try again during a full moon, after receiving mass, but only if their heart was pure and they hadn't just had cheese. That last one's not a joke. Dietary restrictions were also a thing, and here's where it gets darker. In some periods, particularly during the height of religious reform movements, palace bedrooms were targeted by religious zealots. Advisors would pressure monarchs to banish mistresses, punish adulterous courtiers, or even lock up morally dangerous women. One French king was advised to destroy all erotic paintings in his private collection. He agreed, then had copies made and stored secretly in a hidden gallery. Because of course he did. But don't think monks were immune to hypocrisy. Behind monastery walls, all kinds of forbidden desires simmered. There are letters, court records, even confessions from monks caught in affairs with noblewomen, or with each other. Some monasteries were rumoured to be hotbeds of secret sexuality, so much so that certain royals stopped donating to them out of concern for moral contagion. Yet they still took advice from these same men about how, when, and why they should or shouldn't touch their spouses. And masturbation. Oh, it was treated as the worst kind of violation. Some religious manuals instructed royal confessors to ask detailed questions about self-pleasure during adolescence. If a young prince was found to be exploring, he might be sent to confession daily, ordered to sleep on hard surfaces or wear hair shirts under his clothes. One English nobleman reportedly caught his son with a servant and responded by sending both to separate monasteries for cleansing. No word on whether that worked. Probably not. Modern historians argue over just how much of this sexual control was really believed, and how much was about keeping people in line. After all, guilt is a great tool for obedience. If you can convince someone that their private thoughts are sinful, you can control them even when they're alone, especially when they're alone. You move now into an antechamber once used for royal confessions. It's small, with one carved wooden chair, and a kneeling bench worn smooth by generations of penitent knees. You wonder how many secrets passed through this room, how many queens admitted to lust, how many kings confessed with fingers crossed, planning their next affair before the absolution was even finished. Because here's the thing, religion and sex in royal courts weren't opposites. They were tangled together. One made the other more dangerous, and more powerful. By turning desire into sin, the church didn't suppress it. It sharpened it, made it something to hide, something to risk, something worth everything. And behind those risks, behind the rituals and prayers and secret flagellations, you start to hear the soft, unmistakable sound of humanity trying to survive the roles it was forced to play. You're stepping through a worn wooden door now, one that creaks like it's been trying to stay closed for centuries. On the other side, a staircase spiralling downward, not into opulence, but into the heartbeat of the palace. Below the frescoes, the chandeliers, the velvet curtained scandal dens, lies the world of the staff, the cooks, the scullery maids, the valets, and the guards who knew more about royal sex lives than the actual spouses sometimes did. This is where the linens were washed, the rumours were born, and the real history was whispered in low voices over buckets of suds. Welcome to scandal in the servants' quarters. As you descend, the air thickens with the scent of smoke, soap, and old stone. It's warmer down here, somehow more alive. Unlike the carefully manicured stories upstairs, these corridors pulse with the raw reality of palace life, where the boundaries between servant and observer, between helper and accomplice, were often so blurred you'd need a lifetime to sort them out. And sometimes, people down here didn't even bother trying. Let's be honest, royal sex required logistics. Someone had to change the sheets, someone had to carry the secret letters, hide the jewellery, smuggle in the warm wine. Someone had to pretend they didn't hear the queen weeping, or the mistress laughing, or the argument that ended with broken glass and a sudden vacancy in the bedchamber. And those someones? They were everywhere. Take the chambermaids, for example. They were expected to remain invisible but knew everything. They undressed the queen, noticed when her undergarments were ripped or stained or mysteriously misplaced. They knew when the king visited, and when he didn't. They smelled unfamiliar perfume on royal linens. They picked up discarded love notes from under the bed, sometimes on purpose, sometimes just by being in the wrong or right place at the right time. One fringe fact that historians still marvel at. In some courts, maids were trained to interpret the condition of sheets as part of their duties. After a royal wedding night, it wasn't just about changing the linens, it was about reporting what they saw or didn't see. A lack of blood could launch an investigation, a broken bedpost could spark a legend, and these women walked a fine line between honesty and survival. Say too much and you might be dismissed. Say too little, and someone might assume you're protecting the wrong person. But it wasn't just the women. Male servants, valets, grooms, footmen, also found themselves entangled in the quiet chaos, especially if they were handsome, well-placed, or unfortunately noticed by someone powerful. There are accounts of valets who became favourites of kings or queens, sometimes consensually, sometimes not. One French footman wrote years later that he was summoned to the queen's dressing room under the pretext of fixing a curtain. He never saw the curtain, but he did end up wearing a new doublet the next day. No one asked questions. Everyone knew the answer. Then there's the role of the laundresses, arguably the most quietly informed people in the palace. They handled everything. The linens, the shifts, the underthings. They saw stains. They saw blood. They knew which fabrics were hastily washed and why. If a pregnancy was hidden or faked, it was often the laundress who knew first. And because they were low-ranking, they were easy to overlook, which made them perfect messengers, or when times got tough, blackmailers. Which brings us to the real truth down here. Power wasn't only in the throne room, it lurked in the kitchens, in the laundry rooms, in the back hallways where servants passed messages like spies and traded information like gold. Secrets were currency. If you knew which lady-in-waiting was sneaking out at night or which royal physician was bribed to lie about a queen's condition, you could rise, quietly, discreetly, and sometimes permanently. In some courts, entire shadow networks of servants operated like intelligence agencies. A maid might report to a noblewoman who passed the information to her husband, who then used it to gain influence at court. And sometimes, the servants acted for themselves. There's a case in 17th century England of a kitchen maid who overheard a countess in the throes of a secret affair. She threatened to expose her, unless she was promoted to the Queen's household. She got the job, but this power came with danger. Servants who knew too much were expendable. There are records of sudden illnesses among laundry staff, of footmen found drowned in palace fountains, of letters that went missing only to reappear as anonymous threats to powerful lords. And once in a while, a servant just vanished. No funeral, no records, nothing but a muttered explanation about family business back home. You can guess what really happened. Historians debate just how much the palace elite knew about the web of gossip beneath their feet. Some suggest they underestimated it, believing the servants too lowly to matter. Others argue they used it, feeding misinformation to loyal staff to control rumours or sabotage enemies. But the one thing everyone agrees on, the servants weren't just silent observers, they were players. You reach the kitchen now, enormous, smoky, buzzing with imagined energy. Even in its emptiness, it feels alive. Somewhere in this room, someone once slipped a note into a cake. Someone else probably flirted with the wrong noblewoman. A few lives were likely destroyed, a few others elevated. It's easy to think power only lives upstairs, but anyone who's ever worked behind the curtain knows. The stagehands always know the ending before the audience does. And maybe that's the most haunting part of all this. While history remembers kings and queens, it forgets the people who made their desires possible. The ones who watched from behind the drapes, who buried the secrets in soap and ash, who saw what really happened when the doors were closed and the crown was off. Because if you want to know the truth about sex in royal palaces, don't look at the thrones. Look at the laundry rooms. That's where the real stories were scrubbed clean. You're climbing back up now, up a narrow service staircase that loops around like a corkscrew and opens into a long gilded corridor where light pools in soft amber from high leaded windows. This part of the palace feels too ornate to be real. Walls inlaid with gold leaf, ceilings painted with gods lounging on clouds, the scent of old perfume lingering in the air like a memory. But the beauty here is misleading, because this wasn't just a space for living, it was a carefully curated illusion, one designed to hide everything bubbling beneath the surface. And tonight, you're peeling back the curtain on something very particular, how performance and propaganda shaped every story told about sex in royal palaces. Welcome to the world of myth-making, fertility theatre, and the PR spin of the silk-clad elite. You pass a painted door, slightly ajar. Inside, a velvet-covered chaise, a harp gathering dust, and a mirror just large enough to see yourself in, if you're standing in exactly the right spot. This, ironically, is how most royal stories were shaped. Just enough truth, but only from one angle, especially when it came to sex. The monarchy's reputation was tied not just to politics or war or diplomacy, it was tangled, deeply and irrevocably, with the image of the ruler's body, strong, virile, fertile, desired. And so, every kiss, every child, every whisper of scandal was filtered through a narrative machine built to seduce the public as much as any lover. Let's start with fertility rituals. You might think those were limited to temples and village festivals, but no. Palaces had their own versions, dressed in silk and carried out under candlelight. When a royal couple had been married for months with no pregnancy, certain courts staged elaborate symbolic ceremonies. In France, a queen might be blessed in a fertility procession, led through the halls under garlands of flowers, as if willing the womb to cooperate. In Russia, the Tsarina's bed would be anointed with holy oils. In some courts, young children were sent into the royal chambers to bring luck before conception attempts. It sounds bizarre now, but at the time it was state business. A royal pregnancy wasn't private, it was political theatre. And if the pregnancy happened, the celebration began immediately. Public prayers, masses, songs composed to honour the fecund couple, portraits commissioned before the child had fingers. The king's virility was praised in pamphlets and poems, while the queen's body became the property of the nation, dissected in court gossip and international letters. Was she glowing? Was her waist thickening at the correct rate? How many maids had been assigned to track her cravings? One royal court even went so far as to place a scribe outside the queen's bedroom door to log every sigh and shuffle during the final weeks of pregnancy. Because the appearance of royal sex working, of heirs arriving on schedule, was vital to the kingdom's sense of order. But what if things went wrong? That's where the myth-making really kicked in. Stillbirths were never just stillbirths. They became omens, punishments, or court secrets. If a queen miscarried, the story might be recast as a false labour or blessed trial of patience. If she failed to conceive, physicians might issue flattering explanations. Her virtue was too pure, her spirit too anxious from devotion to her people. Never mind that her husband was 62 and hadn't gotten anyone pregnant in a decade. The image had to be preserved. And then there were the love affairs. When a royal romance flourished in public, especially if it involved a favoured mistress, the palace would often lean into it. Poems would be published anonymously, but clearly sponsored. Paintings commissioned, even plays performed that mimicked the passionate but noble connection. One mistress in 18th century France had her own wing of the palace, her likeness carved into fountains and vases. Her role was clear. She wasn't just the king's companion. She was a symbol of his vitality, his taste, his dangerous charm, as long as she behaved, that is. The moment she caused trouble, or threatened the queen's position, she could be rewritten as a seductress, a distraction, a dangerous whore in disguise. A fringe fact that's deliciously ironic. In some royal courts, the official painter was more important than the royal physician, because portraits could correct reality in ways no doctor could. A king who was aging and sickly might be painted broad-shouldered and ruddy, a baby on his knee and a loving wife by his side, even if that wife hadn't touched him in years. A queen who was lonely and childless might be painted with cherubs in the background, symbols of fertility that were never questioned. The canvas didn't lie, but it didn't tell the truth either. And those portraits weren't just for domestic display. They were often sent abroad to foreign courts to show that all was well. The royal couple looked happy. The children were strong. The bedroom was productive. Never mind the affairs, the dead infants, the arguments. What mattered was the image. In one case, a queen's portrait was retouched after her death to make her look healthier, to support the story that she died peacefully and not, allegedly, from complications after a failed abortion. This level of propaganda didn't just happen once, it was systematic. There were court writers whose entire job was to spin narratives that aligned with the monarch's image. If a scandal broke, an affair, a bastard child, an accusation of impotence, the story would be reframed. A rival nation spreading lies, a vengeful ex-lover, a jealous noble seeking revenge. In a world where literacy was growing but skepticism lagged behind, these explanations usually stuck. The public rarely saw past the satin curtain. Of course, not everyone bought it. Gossip thrived anyway. Satirical pamphlets, often anonymous, circulated with salacious rumours about who was sleeping with whom, what happened behind closed doors, what really caused the Queen's miscarriage. These pamphlets were illegal, but impossible to fully control. In fact, many historians now rely on them to piece together the real sexual politics of the time, grain of salt included. As you walk through another chamber, this one lined with mirrors and perfumed like some tragic Valentine's Day gone stale, you start to see it more clearly. Royal sex wasn't just physical, it was ideological, a system of images, stories, performances, all crafted to maintain power, even when the truth was sagging in bed and asking for another glass of wine. Because if the monarch's body failed, the entire illusion cracked. And so they kept the lights low, the painters busy, and the servants quiet. They invented passion where there was boredom, invented heirs where there were none, invented desire when, in reality, someone was just tired, lonely, and expected to produce something. Love, children, power, on demand. You leave the mirrored room without looking back. You already know what's behind you, and it's not your reflection. It's someone else's fantasy, staged, retouched, and framed in gold. You find yourself moving slower now, your feet brushing against a plush carpet that swallows sound like velvet quicksand. You're deeper in the palace than before, deeper not in space necessarily, but in time. This corridor feels older, the wood darker, the paintings more stern. The portraits lining the walls aren't of mistresses or fashionable queens. They're the other women, the forgotten ones, the other halves of scandals, the ones who were blamed, discarded, locked away, or simply rewritten out of the story. Because for every royal romance, every seduction, every public affair dressed up as poetry, there was someone left behind. Welcome to the fallout. The wives scorned, the children disavowed, the lives unravelled in the shadows of silk bedsheets. You step into a modest salon, smaller than the grand reception rooms but no less ornate. The walls are papered in faded damask, the chairs still arranged as if company might arrive at any moment. But no one does. This is a room for waiting, for grieving, for wondering when, or if, you'll ever be seen again. Because in royal palaces, when sex goes wrong, it rarely ends with just an awkward breakfast. It ends with banishment, with exile, with silence so loud it echoes down through centuries. Let's start with the wives. Real, legitimate queens who were told, publicly, humiliatingly, that they were no longer good enough. Sometimes it was because they couldn't produce an heir, sometimes because their faces aged, or because the king got bored, or because someone younger, hungrier, and more politically useful caught his eye. Catherine of Aragon, remember her, was married to Henry VIII for over 2 decades, gave him years of loyalty, political alliance, and only one surviving daughter. But when Anne Boleyn started fluttering her lashes and wearing yellow, Catherine was shoved aside, stripped of her title, and forced to live in isolation until she died, alone, unseen, unheard. And what about Caroline of Brunswick, wife to George IV of England? Their marriage was a train wreck from the start. He claimed she smelled weird, she claimed he was drunk the entire wedding. But when he tried to divorce her years later, the trial turned into a public scandal. She was accused of everything from adultery to mental instability. The public, surprisingly, took her side. But it didn't save her. She was barred from his coronation. She showed up anyway and was physically turned away from the abbey doors, a queen by law, rejected in front of thousands. Her crime being inconvenient. But the heartbreak wasn't limited to queens. Royal mistresses who fell out of favour often suffered equally dramatic downfalls. One day you're draped in jewels and whispered about like a goddess. The next, you're exiled. Your name crossed out in court records. Your portraits removed from the gallery wall. If you were lucky, you married well. If not, you died forgotten. And the worst part, you usually didn't even see it coming. In many courts, falling in love with a monarch was like juggling lit torches while standing on an iced-over pond. Graceful, thrilling, and doomed. Here's a fringe fact that's as bleak as it is fascinating. In the 17th century, one Austrian archduchess was sent back to her home convent after being jilted by a future emperor. Not because she was unfaithful, but because she wasn't interesting enough. Her letters, preserved in a dusty archive, reveal a woman confused, embarrassed, and still calling him my beloved, even after the engagement was broken. He married someone younger, prettier, with better diplomatic ties. Love didn't stand a chance. And then there were the children, the illegitimate ones, the maybe legitimate ones, the bastards born of real love or quick mistakes. In some courts, they were acknowledged, given titles, land, even marriages, but in others, they were hidden, raised in secret, denied. Some were quietly shipped off to monasteries or military service. Some were passed off as the children of servants. Others were drowned in metaphorical silence, erased from every document like they'd never drawn breath. There's a particularly cruel case from the 18th century France, where a young maid gave birth to the king's child. She'd believed he cared for her. He'd written letters, given her a necklace, even held her hand during a moonlit walk. But once the pregnancy was undeniable, she was dismissed. The child, according to palace rumour, was reassigned to another family. No surname, no trace. The necklace? Pawned by her brother to pay for the journey home. And that's the thing. In these stories, everyone wants to focus on the romance, the seduction, the scandal. But for every bed warmed by passion, there was someone else left cold. For every secret kiss, someone else lost their place at court. For every child born in silk, another was hidden behind a servant's screen, rocking in a cradle carved for a life they'd never have. The emotional debris of royal sex was massive. And it didn't just affect individuals, it shaped nations. A rejected queen could send her powerful family into revolt. An angry mistress might leak state secrets. A bastard prince, raised bitter and overlooked, could start a war. These weren't just private heartbreaks, they were political landmines. Modern scholars argue about the morality of these stories. Were these people victims, or complicit in the system? Should we feel sorry for the queen who clawed her way to power, only to be tossed aside for someone younger? Or was she just the latest link in a centuries-old chain of transactional intimacy? Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe it doesn't matter, because what's undeniable is that real people suffered, and most of them didn't have ballads written about it. You stop before a wide window overlooking the palace gardens. From here you can see the long, perfect rows of hedges, the marble statues, the reflecting pool so calm it doesn't even ripple in the wind. It's also orderly, so serene. But beneath that calm is the memory of every lover who was discarded, every wife who was sent away, every child who asked where their father was and got silence in return. That's what royal sex left behind. Not just airs, not just gossip, but pain. Deep, quiet, often invisible pain, tucked into the corners of salons like this one, where no one thought to ask who was missing. You turn down a hallway that barely feels like part of the same palace anymore. Less gold, more shadow. The walls here are darker wood, unpolished, the air slightly musty, as if it remembers every word ever whispered within it. You've wandered into the part of the palace where secrets aren't just born, they're studied. Where every door might open onto a hidden staircase, or a quiet library, or a bedroom that was sealed off after something went terribly, terribly wrong. And tonight, you're stepping into one of the most unsettling chapters of all: manipulation, coercion, and the deeply unsettling power dynamics that unfolded when sex was no longer a private act, but a tool of statecraft, surveillance, or control. You enter a room that once belonged to a royal advisor. Nothing fancy. Bookshelves, a desk, a map of Europe with tiny holes where pins once marked political marriages and family alliances. But you can almost feel the weight of the choices made in this room. Who would marry whom, who would be sent where, and who would be offered up like a gift wrapped in lace, as though their body was just another chess piece. Because royal palaces weren't just places of seduction and pleasure, they were machines built to maintain control, and sometimes that control extended all the way into the bedroom, especially when sex became a strategy, not a desire. Start with the basics. Royal marriages were rarely about love. We know this. But what's less talked about is how often sex itself was used as a form of leverage, especially by advisors, relatives, or even monarchs themselves. There are stories of young princesses being prepared for marriage by being lectured in detail about their sexual duties by older female relatives. In some courts, this meant awkward anatomy lessons. In others, it meant deeply disturbing invasions of privacy, tests, inspections, and in extreme cases monitored consummation. Yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. In certain royal households, the consummation of a marriage wasn't considered official until it had been witnessed, either through literal presence, curtains drawn but ears pricked, or by inspecting the bed afterward. In France and England, this was sometimes a ceremonial event, complete with toasts and jokes, until the door shut and the pressure to perform kicked in. The king's manhood and the queen's virtue were both on trial, and failure could mean war, so no pressure. But it wasn't just about royal couples. Courtiers and servants were also used, sometimes coerced, into sexual roles they never signed up for. In Louis XIV's Versailles, certain noblewomen were encouraged to become mistresses to secure their family's position. The duke's daughter might be subtly pushed toward the king with a new gown and a whispered suggestion from her mother, and if she succeeded, the family was rewarded. If she failed, they were often punished. One fringe fact that will make your skin crawl: in some palaces, young men were groomed to serve as companions to visiting dignitaries, offered not officially, of course, but through implication and opportunity. It wasn't called prostitution, it was diplomacy. And those young men, usually orphans, pages, or minor nobles hoping to climb the social ladder, they had no real choice. Say no, and your career ended before it started. Say yes, and you were rewarded with proximity to power and all the moral decay that came with it. And then there's the realm of surveillance. If you think sex in royal palaces happened in privacy, think again. Walls had ears, beds had eyes. In more than one European court, spies were paid to observe royal bedrooms. Not just the official ones, but the secret trysts too. Lovers were followed, servants were bribed, even mistresses had mistresses, tasked with reporting back to ministers or rival nobles. You're probably asking why. Why all this spying and scripting and pressure? The answer is simple and awful, because sex could end dynasties. One affair, one bastard child, one betrayal could shift alliances, bankrupt families, or plunge entire countries into war. So they watched, they controlled, and when that wasn't enough, they rewrote the truth entirely. There's a particularly dark tale from the court of Philip II of Spain. One of his mistresses was caught trying to leave the palace late at night, alone, barefoot, crying. What happened before that moment is lost to time, but the official record says she was removed for conduct unbecoming. Her family never saw her again. The unspoken truth? She may have refused something, or said something, or simply fallen out of favour after serving her political purpose. She was a pawn, and she was discarded. But the manipulation didn't always come from above. Sometimes it came from within. Palace life was competitive, and people used whatever tools they had to climb the social ladder, including sex. Mistresses sometimes blackmailed their way into better rooms, titles, or pensions. Advisors slept with rivals' lovers to gain intelligence. A charming bedmate could become the eyes and ears of an entire faction. And the emotional cost, usually ignored. After all, if your tears aren't strategic, what's the point? Historians are still divided on how much agency these individuals had. Were they victims, opportunists, survivors? Maybe all three. Some queens orchestrated their own sexual image to wield power. Some mistresses plotted their ascent with calculated skill, and others were just caught in the system, raised to believe that their worth began and ended between the sheets of the right man's bed. You stop in front of a cabinet. Inside, under glass, lies a single ribbon. Pale pink, faded with age. According to legend, it once belonged to a noblewoman who vanished from court after the king lost interest. Her story wasn't recorded, her name was removed from the guest lists, but someone saved the ribbon. Maybe a maid, maybe a lover. Maybe someone who remembered that she had once laughed too loudly during a state dinner and was told to be less vivid. And maybe that's what hurts the most. These weren't just shadowy figures in forgotten rooms. They were real people, with bodies and fears and hopes they didn't dare speak aloud, and they were used, twisted into symbols, tools, or threats. Because royal sex was never just about pleasure. It was about power, and power always leaves someone crushed beneath it. You glance at the hallway behind you, then ahead, toward another dark doorway. You know now what waits inside isn't just silk and perfume, it's strategy, it's control, and sometimes it's coercion dressed up as courtship. You've almost reached the end now, not the end of the palace. No, that place is endless in its secrets, but the end of this particular path. The scandal, the desire, the manipulation, it's all been leading here to the quiet aftermath that most historians don't like to talk about. You walk now through a long, echoing corridor where the air tastes older, the light dimmer, and the walls bare of portraits. There are no smiling kings or jewelled queens here, just doors that don't open anymore, windows that were sealed shut, and a silence so heavy it settles on your shoulders like a cloak. Because tonight, we're talking about what happens after the crown slips, after the desire fades, after the power is gone. This is where we meet the forgotten bodies, the aged, the sick, the sexually irrelevant, the people who were once praised for their beauty, their seduction, their reproductive value, and then discarded, erased, or quietly locked away. You stop at one of those sealed doors. The plaque is so worn you can't read the name anymore. Maybe that's the point. Because in royal palaces, once you're no longer useful, once your body stops giving birth, or your charm fades, or your secrets dry up, you're no longer needed in the story. You become part of the furniture, or the wallpaper, or the rumour someone only half remembers. Let's start with the queens, the former ones, the widows, the barren, the too old to care ones. Some were allowed to live out their days in small apartments tucked into lesser-used wings of the palace. Not prison exactly, just politely contained. Their power stripped, their letters censored, their names only mentioned when absolutely necessary. A few still held court in a minor way, welcoming nieces, playing chess, writing lonely letters to bishops. But others faded completely. One Spanish queen spent 20 years living in a room with no mirror, allegedly because she couldn't bear to see her own aging face after being publicly praised for her beauty most of her life. A body once celebrated, now too real for the legend. And it wasn't just queens. Mistresses who outlasted their prime were often quietly married off to minor nobles, or worse, sent to convents. Imagine that. One year you're being fed truffles in bed by a king who says you're the most radiant woman in Europe. The next, you're praying 5 times a day beside a shriveled nun who doesn't believe in second chances. Your name doesn't disappear overnight. It evaporates. Even in records, it's always formally favoured. Once beloved, previously attached. A footnote. Men didn't always fare better. Royal favourites, especially those who relied on charm more than title, could tumble hard and fast. One French courtier, notorious for his midnight visits to both king and queen, yes, both, lost favour after an illness ruined his looks. He was given a small estate far from court. No one visited. He died there of melancholy, which back then was code for depression, or perhaps something even slower, more invisible, shame, boredom, the absence of the only thing he'd ever been rewarded for. Here's a fringe fact that hits like a gut punch. In some courts, the sexual histories of courtiers were recorded in private ledgers, handwritten notebooks kept by advisors or monarchs themselves. These weren't meant for scandal, they were practical. So-and-so was too fertile. This one, unreliable. That one, no longer discreet. These entries weren't cruel exactly, they were clinical. But the effect was the same. A person reduced to a line item in someone else's history. Used, done, next. And then there's the issue of illness, the elephant in every four-poster room. Before modern medicine, sexually transmitted infections were rampant in royal courts. Syphilis in particular carved its way through generations of monarchs and mistresses. It started with sores, then headaches, then madness. Some wore gloves and heavy makeup to hide the disfigurement. Others simply vanished from public view. In the 16th century, a once beloved court musician was quietly dismissed after lesions appeared on his face. The official story? Artistic temperament. The truth? Likely late-stage syphilis, contracted from a woman who'd once been the king's autumn muse. The chain of seduction broken by blood. Pregnancy, especially when it ended badly, was another turning point. For women who were praised only when pregnant, failure was brutal. A stillbirth could mean suspicion, a miscarriage, disgrace. But even surviving childbirth wasn't a guarantee of status. After the final child, especially if it was a daughter, many royal women were simply left behind. They were no longer needed. Not as lovers, not as mothers, not as symbols. One of the more haunting scholarly debates revolves around palace hysteria, a term used by 19th century doctors to describe what we might now recognise as trauma, depression, or burnout among high-born women. It was blamed on nerves, on overactive imaginations, on womb wandering. But really, it was the aftermath of being wanted for one thing and then not at all. There are reports of queens who refused to leave their rooms, who talked to mirrors, who clutched old letters like relics. The body's political usefulness was gone, and no one knew what to do with the soul that remained. You pass a mirror yourself now. It's cloudy, the silver beneath the glass beginning to crack. For a second, you almost see someone else's face in it. Powdered, tear-streaked, half-lit by candlelight. Maybe it's someone real, or maybe it's just all the women who stood here before you, asking the same unspoken question. Was that all I was worth? But this isn't just about tragedy. Some reclaim their stories. A few former queens became scholars, writers, even patrons of art. They built new lives out of the rubble of their sexual relevance. But even then, history rarely credits them for it. They're still remembered as lovers, or mothers, or failed vessels. Never as people who endured, who survived the worst kind of erasure, being seen only for your desirability and then punished for losing it. You reach a locked door at the end of the corridor. It doesn't need to open. You already know what's behind it. Silence, dust, and 1,000 stories no one wanted to write down. The people who once burned bright in candlelight, who loved and ached and were punished for being human in a world that only valued the performance. Because the truth is, the palace never truly stops taking. Even when the nights are quiet, even when the stories are done, it keeps collecting what's left behind. The forgotten bodies, the closed mouths, the hearts no longer useful. And somewhere, in some darkened wing, they're still waiting to be remembered. You're here, the last room, not the grand ballroom, not the chapel, not the velvet-lined boudoir draped in scandal and whispers. This one's simpler. Stone floor, wooden beams, no gold leaf, no gilded lies. A single chair sits in the centre like it's been waiting for you all along, and around you, silence. Not the tense, secret-laden hush of the palace corridors, but a final, honest quiet. This is where everything you've seen, heard, and probably can't unhear settles into a strange truth. That royal sex wasn't just about lust, or heirs, or politics. It was about humanity stretched to its most performative extremes, and the way history tried and mostly failed to clean up the mess after. You sit, because after everything, you need to. Let's be real. At this point, you've walked through a minefield of royal bedrooms, accidental pregnancies, political mistresses, lonely queens, ambitious courtiers, poisoned perfumes, and enough repression to power a small nation's therapy industry. You've peeked behind the curtains where kings begged like teenagers, where queens cried into embroidered pillows, where servants carried out bloody sheets like it was just part of the day's to-do list. And what's left? What does all of it add up to? The rawest kind of power. Not the sword-wielding, crown-wearing kind. but the kind that slips between the sheets and rewrites history while no one's watching. Because here's the thing, when we talk about royal sex, we're not really talking about sex. We're talking about control, about image, about lineage and fear, and the horrifying idea that your value might start and end with what your body can do for someone else's legacy. And that's what royal palaces were. Giant pressure cookers wrapped in satin and gold, demanding desire on schedule, fertility with flair, and emotion only when it served the state. Take the official rituals again. Remember those public beds, the parades of heirs, the letters written about who looked fertile on a Tuesday? You laugh now, sure. But underneath that ridiculousness was desperation. Monarchs were terrified of chaos. A childless throne, a failed marriage, a scandalous affair with no neat ending, that was political disaster, so they staged everything. And when they couldn't stage it, they lied. Or they punished someone, or they buried the truth in a crypt no one dared open for a few centuries. One fringe fact that sums it all up like a final exhale. Some royal families actually choreographed their sexual legends on purpose. In the 1700s, one Central European court hired a playwright, not just for operas, but to ghostwrite rumours. The court would leak stories of the king's passionate exploits, or the queen's miraculous fertility, to distract from the fact that neither had touched each other in years. The playwright got a bonus every time a foreign diplomat mentioned the stories in a dispatch. This wasn't romance, it was state-sponsored fan fiction. But despite all that theatre, people still slipped through the cracks. Real people. Ones who weren't glamorous or politically convenient. A stable boy who couldn't say no. A handmaiden who wasn't lucky enough to fall in love with her king. A mistress who aged a year too fast. A bastard child who asked the wrong question at the wrong time. And historians? They've spent centuries trying to sort the legend from the aftermath. Some cling to the idea that these were love stories. Others insist they were brutal, transactional arrangements dressed in perfume and pearls. But the most honest scholars will tell you what you've already guessed. It's both. It's neither. It's complicated. Because sure, maybe a few kings really did love their queens. Maybe some mistresses held real influence. Maybe a desperate servant girl really did outmaneuver a duchess. But all of them were still trapped in the same system. One that measured people by their ability to seduce, produce, or keep quiet. You glance around the room one last time. No hidden doors here. No creaky wardrobe that leads to another scandal. Just the echoes of everything we never really learned in school. The dark truth about sex in royal palaces. The stuff textbooks sanitized and museum tours turned into harmless anecdotes. But now you know, the stories aren't harmless. They never were. They were brutal, beautiful, sad, and more human than any painting hanging above a marble fireplace. And maybe that's what matters most. Not just who slept with whom, but what that sleeping meant. How it shaped wars, crowned heirs, broke hearts, silenced women, elevated favourites, doomed nations. Because sex, in a palace, was never just a personal act. It was history. Now you lean back, imagining the palace finally empty, the doors closed, the corridors echoing only with the soft sighs of the past. It's quiet, but not peaceful, because the stories you've traced linger in every shadow, in every gilded mirror, in the faded silk of a long-abandoned bed. You've walked through centuries of ambition, desire, manipulation, and survival, and the weight of it settles gently on your mind. Maybe you feel it in your chest too, that strange mixture of fascination and discomfort. Because the truth about sex in royal palaces isn't about romance. It's about power, about survival, about being both adored and expendable at the same time, about knowing your body can make history, and that history can discard you the moment it's done with you. It's brutal, and somehow entirely human. Think about the queens who had to smile while their husband's attention wandered, the mistresses who were raised up only to be quietly dismissed, the young servants whose proximity to power made them both essential and vulnerable. All of them lived in a system that demanded performance at every turn, and the consequences weren't just whispers, they shaped entire dynasties, prompted wars, and created myths that persist even today. You can feel their tension in the corridors, their calculated gestures in the portraits, and their silences in the empty rooms. Royal palaces weren't just houses, they were stages, laboratories, prisons, and theatres of desire rolled into one, and everyone from monarch to maid had a part to play. And yet, among all that pressure, there were glimpses of agency, resilience, and even quiet rebellion. The queens who wrote letters behind closed doors, the mistresses who wielded influence more cunningly than ministers, the servants who survived and sometimes thrived in spaces designed to suppress them. They remind you that human desire and cunning are never so easily extinguished, no matter how golden the cage. Even in palaces obsessed with appearances and control, there were hearts beating their own rhythm, clever minds navigating an impossible maze, and spirits refusing to be silenced. So as you step back, imagining the palace finally empty and still, you realise the lesson is not just about scandal or sex. It's about the ways power shapes intimacy, the ways human desire is manipulated, and the ways people survive under impossible expectations. It's messy, it's fascinating, it's tragic. But it's also incredibly instructive, because history isn't neat, it's lived, and it's complicated. And when you peel back the silk curtains and gold leaf, you see the people behind the legends, flawed, cunning, desperate, and beautifully human. And as you finally rise, leaving the palace behind in your mind, there's a strange calm. You've seen the darkness, the manipulation, the heartbreak, and somehow the survival. You carry it all quietly, like a secret of your own. And maybe, just maybe, that's the truest story of all. The hidden, messy, human side of history that no crown, chamber, or golden bed can ever fully contain.